Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with the dream team, Elijah Yassi, Ben Bollinger, Erick Ibarra, and of course, as I'm talking, some motorcyclist is going down the street. I don't know if you heard that.
Sorry, guys.
Anyway, we're here to respond today to Seraphim Hamilton's video on the channel Roots of Faith. Great video on why is the Eastern Orthodox Church the one true church. And just to give like a format for today's conversation, what we're going to do first is give some brief reflective statements on just what we think about the video overall. And then we'll get into some specific points throughout the video. And then finally, we'll use the last part for Q&A. So I think let's just get started then with our brief comments. Maybe I have the briefest comments. So I'm just going to go first, and then we can probably go Erick, Elijah, and then Ben. So yeah, I mean, overall, I think all of us are going to attest to the fact that like Seraphim Hamilton, very articulate, very intelligent, a lot of interesting points and a lot of points where I had to like stop and really think about, oh, this is a very interesting objection. This is worthwhile. This is not like the brain rot you usually see online in other areas of conversations. So I really appreciate just Seraphim always brings the A game, and also great production quality in this video. There was a time I remember I was watching it where he mentioned, Pope St. John Paul II's statement on Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. And I remember he said that JP2 didn't consider that to be infallible. And I did like this whole kind of review because I thought, wait a minute, no, I've been told my whole life, basically, from all the top theologians that I read, that this is an infallible statement from the Pope. Well, I'm just going to say to people, you should go read John Joy's book, Disputed Questions on Papal Infallibility, because he defends, right, there we go. He defends the infallible status of that statement. We might go into that later. I don't want to detract too much, but I think that there are reasonable ways to understand what was going on there without it being like, oh, we don't know what the status is of women's ordination in the Catholic Church. It's infallibly settled. Some people think it was ex cathedra, what Pope St. John Paul II said. Others think that it was just an authoritative statement of the Universal Ordinary Magisterium. Regardless, that's sealed in the bag. All right, that's all I'm going to say there. Erick, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Suan, for having me back on your show. It's always a pleasure, and I'm sure we'll have a blast. I do want to echo, the compliments. Seraphim Hamilton is extremely smart. He's charitable. He's a serious thinker. You could tell because when he formulates his opinions, he's trying to frame his opponent in the best way possible, so that if he does procure a defeat, he's defeating the actual perspective of the opponent. And so he does steelman, and I could see that that he does that in good faith. So I actually enjoyed listening to that whole segment. I really enjoyed the testimony that he gave about his spiritual pilgrimage from skepticism, atheism, and then back to Christianity. And I especially appreciated his statements on theistic evolution, creationism. Really hits home for me. And I just think that his insights are brilliant on so many other areas, like the Bible, biblical interpretation, reading the Old Testament as a Christian book. It's just I'm very grateful that he's in the big round table of English content creators on the Orthodox side. When it comes to this issue, though, we have pretty clear disagreements, and anything I say in this presentation, it's all to be taken as just my intent to make clear what those differences are and why we have them. But otherwise, I'm deeply appreciative of Seraphim.
Sweet. Do I go next?
Yeah.
All right. Sweet. Thanks for having me on, Suan, and having us on. It's always a pleasure to be on your channel. And again, I echo the same thing you guys are saying. He's actually probably my favorite Eastern Orthodox apologist, because he's a serious thinker, as you guys would say. he's not a polemicist as much as others, other Eastern Orthodox. They're just trying to kind of win points rather than taking the issues with objectively as possible, we should say, and being sincere with the way he's thinking about the other side and how he's refuting the other side. And I really appreciate that. And I've always wanted to do, a one-on-one with Seraphim. If he's ever willing to do something, I would be interested in doing something like that. He would actually be my favorite person to talk to on these issues, because he knows them so well. I haven't seen an Eastern Orthodox know the issues as well as him. Usually the other ones are straw manning rather than steel manning. He gets some things wrong, but I give him credit on the majority of the things that he was saying. He knows his history. He knows a lot of stuff. And I could probably learn a lot from him in a lot of things that we share in common, East and West. And I really appreciate, like, sometimes I'll watch his streams. I don't know if he still does this, but I used to watch his streams and he would go like 8 hours. It's like it's like, dude, you take like lunch breaks or something. It's like a work shift, It's like, I have an 8-hour work shift and he just goes on there and talking about theology, answering questions. But, I have a lot of things I want to say, but I'm just going to save it as we get into the, the nitty and gritty. So I'll save it for that.
Yeah, I obviously echo everybody's sentiments here. I think I might be the only person here who has had the pleasure of meeting Seraphim in person. We had Noodles and Company together a number of years ago. It was a very pleasant experience. Got to spend a weekend with him at a theology conference here. So he's just a super pleasant guy to be around, incredibly intelligent. I owe a lot of my own theological thinking, especially about the Bible, to Seraphim. I remember when I discovered his Tumblr blog when I was in college, and it totally revolutionized the way that I view scripture and even tradition and things of this nature. And that's what I love about, Seraphim entering this discussion of East-West issues, is that he kind of frames things in a way that you don't often think about. And that's it's just kind of refreshing to hear some of his arguments, that they're obviously not totally disconnected from the other arguments that Orthodox apologists make, but their rhetorical style and some of the details of them have that kind of like Seraphim flair to them that I really appreciate. So, and this video that we're going to be responding to is no exception. Very well done. Obviously, we all have some disagreements with a number of the points that he makes, but the video itself, I'm very appreciative to Seraphim for making the video. And a Facebook post, I think it's actually worth engaging. And so I hope that this video is, a testament to how much we appreciate Seraphim's contribution to this dialogue. So,
yeah, Ben, wonderfully put, and everyone did a wonderful job. So now Erick was able to send me kind of 13 points that he wanted to look at throughout the video. And we'll just go hit those 13 points one by one. Elijah sent me some timestamps. So once again, if they overlap, we can try to get everything together. But obviously, we're going to try our best to just, if we don't have a timestamp, to just fairly represent what Seraphim said. So with that out of the way, then let's start with the first point that Erick wanted to cover, which is the claim that the church, with its institutional expression, must have a concrete pilgrimage throughout history. Erick, do you want to talk about this claim?
Yeah. So, initially, Jonathan, the host of that show, Roots of Faith, had asked Seraphim, why is the Eastern Orthodox Church the true church? And Seraphim prefaces his answer. He gives a rather long introduction by illustrating to the listener that Christ established a visible institutional church that has a hierarchical organization, and that it has rules for perpetual governance. And he contrasts this greatly with ecclesiastical polities of the Protestants, for example, who essentially have a self-constituted authority structure that it doesn't really depend on the rule of succession or any kind of unbroken line through tactile ordination. And so he contrasts these two things and says that the church, because it was organized with a hierarchy, Christ, the apostles, and then the apostles ordained their successors, that the visible church, in its institutional expression, needs to exist from the beginning all the way up to our present day. And I thought that was a very good point, because what it basically does is it says, okay, any ecclesiology that claims to be self-constituted, i.e., basically all of Protestantism, you can put an asterisk next to the Anglicans, and for those who have a lot of time, put another asterisk for the Polish National Church and some of these other old Catholic Church communions. There's always some group that's a breakoff that has some sort of a claim to the ordination of the original Catholic Church. But besides that, the options for what the true church is in the first 10 centuries really comes down to the Catholic Church, the Orthodox churches, and then obviously, with that, the Oriental Orthodox and the Church of the East as well. And this is a good point. So it sets the stage for, we are really looking at the options that the options for the true church are the churches that have apostolic succession, and that its institutional expression is perpetual. And so that's a good start. Okay. Now, the one thing I would say, and this is something that he brings up later, is that sometimes Catholic apologists will try to employ things of human reason or natural reason to sort of get their claws into the question of which of the options is the true one, with what works the best philosophically, and obviously having a universal head in whom inheres absolute, or say supreme jurisdiction, power, primacy, authority, is going to be the best one to maintain unity. And I'd hate to start off with saying that we're going to go in that direction, confirming Seraphim's his criticisms. But I do want to say very briefly, and then we'll pass it to Elijah, is that there is an Anglican that converted to the Catholic Church. I consider him a St. John Henry Newman for me, because he was an English Episcopal clergyman who actually took the Greek claims as his central focus in the investigation of the true church. Newman didn't really do that. He focused more on the Anglican Church, the Oxford movement, and the, if you want to call it, the neo-patristic synthesis of the English people. But Frederick Kinsman is another Anglican clergyman. He lived later than Newman. He lived into the 20th century. I believe he died in the 1940s. But it really came down for him between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. He really wanted to go into the Orthodox Church. He even traveled to the East, visited monasteries, went to Chalcedon, where the council was held in the 5th century, visited Rome. And over 20 years, he came to the decision that he really appreciated the Eastern Orthodox emphasis on the episcopate. But he realized that the episcopate can't really be the episcopate if it doesn't maintain its unicity or its singular identity. And this is a problem that he faced in the dialogue with the Orthodox churches in the 1900s. Back in the States, he was actually participant in some of these dialogues between Anglicans and the Orthodox. And he soon realized that you can't really have an ecumenical dialogue between Anglicans and Orthodox, or with anybody in the Orthodox, because you might get 10 or 15 metropolitans in New York City on one day that say one thing. But then on another day, with different metropolitans from a different area, different church, different autocephalous commission, that says something radically different, and whose value will be for that separate group, that separate autocephalous body. And so really, when you're dialoguing with the Orthodox Church, you're dialoguing with parts. You're not dialoguing with an entity that has singular frame, that the value of which keeps rolling back to that singular frame. Oh, this is what the Orthodox Church says. And so he said that there has to be some sort of principle of unification to maintain unity for the episcopate to be the episcopate. Because even with as much impetus that's put upon the local bishop, and in the Orthodox in the 1900s, we're always talking about that, Saint Cyprian of Carthage and the local bishop and the almost not the independence, but the autocephalous nature of the church. But for a primate in the Orthodox Church to really be able to be effective, his words can't be in competition with other parts of the church, because if and when they are, then his role as an individual bishop is weakened. And so even an individual bishop in his individual diocese or eparchy depends upon his ability to mirror or reflect the universal faith. And in order to do that, his position has to be sort of bridled by a universal representation. And this is one of the reasons why in the First Vatican Council, that papal supremacy is not just seen as some sort of like center of gravity pulling everyone into Rome, but it's also something that enables the local bishops everywhere in the world to do what they're supposed to do. So there's a mutual strength coming from both ends. Now, Seraphim, will say, well, the real question is that the ecclesiology of the first millennium? And I do want to respect that. So that's why we're going to do what we're going to do today.
Right. Just to kind of bounce off that really quick, Eric, and then we can get to Elijah or Ben, whoever has a comment. It sounds like to me what you were saying, Eric, is that you can understand like the importance of this concrete pilgrimage throughout history, and especially like for Seraphim, I think the thing that he finds really decisive or should be decisive is continuity. Yeah. Right. The question of continuity. Whereas I think what you're trying to say is, that is a relevant, that's a desideratum. That's a thing that we want, right, in our defense of the true church or identification of it. But we have to consider some of the practical questions of I don't know if you want to go this far, but actually I think you were just saying from the nature of the episcopacy itself, and for the church to be able to effectively do what it was tasked by Christ to do, right, then we would expect something like this universal representative to empower the bishops, which is what Vatican I was intending.
Yeah. So in other words, all I'm trying to say here is that Seraphim opened up his answer to Jonathan's question with an appeal to this institutional theory of church government. And I'm just trying to say, yes, amen. Great place to start. But it is an interesting observation that someone like Frederick Kinsman can say he can appreciate the value that the Orthodox put upon just the episcopate, sort of a equal Episcopalian equality across the boards. There's primacies of honor, canonical primacies, but every bishop is the same. Kinsman can appreciate that, but he found that if in its practice in the course of history, especially up to the 1900s, talking to an Orthodox bishop diminished its value because he could be contended with by just other bishops. And there was no anchor that we could find and address to that would get us to the treasure, the one treasure, right? It's just one part of the Orthodox Church versus another part of the Orthodox Church versus another part of the Orthodox Church. And I just want to say to Seraphim, this is a great place to start, but understand one of the angles that we as Catholics come from is we do want to, and we do want the episcopate to shine like the stars. But in many ways, the organization of the Orthodox Church diminishes the brightness of a local bishop because now his voice is not necessarily carrying a lot of force.
All right, Elijah or Ben, who wants to go next?
You can go ahead, Ben.
Sure. Yeah, well said. Well said, Eric. I don't have too much to add to that specific point. Commenting on how Seraphim starts his video, I could see the writings of St. Francis de Sales kind of rearing their head in his introduction. I'm sure you guys probably picked up on that as well. The whole argument about, you either receive a divine commission directly from God or through intermediaries. So I don't know if Seraphim has read St. Francis de Sales. I know he's talked about him before, so I wouldn't be surprised. But I very much appreciated that aspect to it, how he kind of shows why we need to look at the apostolic churches, referring to Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Oriental Orthodoxy, as opposed to the Protestant traditions. And Eric, I think you're totally right that one of the issues that the Orthodox run into is they have that continuity with the institution that Christ created in the apostolate, right? They see that in their bishops. But Seraphim Hamilton, as somebody who is, a lover of sacred scripture, right, he himself recognizes that Peter in the Bible has this role of headship to play. So Eric, kind of like what you're describing, from a more philosophical kind of angle, or at least, practical angle. I think we see it present even in scripture, that even Christ himself recognizes that even though he has this institution of the apostolate, he still sets one person as the head over it. And so, as Seraphim mentioned, right, if we want to justify the existence of our current rulers, the current successors of the apostles, it seems that we need to make room for this character of Peter and a successor of Peter. And Seraphim, he kind of addresses this a little bit later in this video. He has some interesting things to say about whether or not the Petrine headship in the church is divinely instituted. Perhaps we'll get to talk about that a little bit later. But just right off the bat, I thought, that's something that I would have liked to see maybe a little bit more discussion from Seraphim about, is how that continuity is made between not just the Apostolic College and the Episcopal College, as is implied, but even that idea that the Apostolic College had a head. And so what does that look like in its successor, the Episcopal College? And by whose command does that head rule? Because like Seraphim said, you either receive that right directly from God or indirectly through successors. And so what does that process look like in terms of headship? I think could have been elaborated more by Seraphim, and I'm sure we'll go into more of that. So that's what I have to say about Seraphim's introduction.
Yeah, Eric, do you want to say anything really quick? I saw you kind of.
I just want to say that he didn't make reference to St. Francis de Sales, but he made reference to an Anglican that I happen to be very familiar with, Felix Serlot. He referenced his book. It's a really thick, like 800-page book on apostolic succession. Serlot basically wrote in, I think, the 20th century. So he's basically taking a lot of St. Francis de Sales, whether knowingly or unknowingly. Us Catholics are more familiar with the earlier, the magnum opus, the Catholic Controversy by St. Francis de Sales. Guys like Seraphim, Perry Robinson, some of those Anglicans, they're more familiar with Felix Serlot. So he's like the St. Francis de Sales for a lot of people.
Well said from both of you guys, all three of you guys, really. I'm just going to briefly talk about this. I'm not going to go into too much. I'm sure, like Ben was saying, we'll get into it more. But it is evident that the church has wisdom in talking about primacy and collegiality together, primacy and the episcopacy. We have that at Vatican I and Vatican II. And I don't think the East can claim to be the original church if they don't have a teaching on primacy, because we know that primacy existed in some way shape, or form. And then you have Seraphim Hamilton, who admits that the East do not have an agreed upon teaching on primacy. And he says that the East needs to bring to the table what primacy would look like. So, but even if they were to do that in, let's say, 2025, that does not address the fact that the original church had primacy in theology and in praxis, and the East haven't had a headship or primate. And even if some folks will say, oh, that's, Bartholomew, right? But Patriarch Bartholomew is that primacy. Well, no one listens to him, right? So what kind of primacy is that? There's not again, it is not an agreed upon primacy in the East. So that's not really primacy unless there's something that's taught that everyone can say, okay, this is when the primate can speak authoritatively and this is when he can't, or what have you. So that's what I wanted to say here just briefly, but we'll get into this more and more as we go to the points.
Yeah, before we move on, does anyone want to add anything before we wrap up this first point?
I think what I'd have to add will be addressed as we go down. So
okay.
I'm good on my end.
Right. Well, then let's go to the second claim. So the second claim is that, and these are kind of paraphrases of what Seraphim said. They're not like, verbatim, but I think it captures really faithfully like what Seraphim basically said, just a heads up. Anyway, second claim. When you look at the 11th century, everyone agrees that there is a major institutional revolution that is happening in the West. There is a substantial change in the way that I think the Latins are thinking about the church. Continuity is an identifying mark of the true church, and so Rome essentially broke with continuity. Erick, maybe I'll let you start with this one again too.
Yeah, thank you, Suan. Yeah, so some of these are paraphrases. I think most of them are verbatim quotes, but but there are a couple that I kind of added a preposition or two there. But yeah, so one of his first substantial answers favoring orthodoxy over Catholicism is, nailing down on this issue of continuity as the identifying mark of the true church, which again, we agree with. And then he made the claim that everyone agrees, historians, whether they're Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, atheist, whatever, they all agree that in the 11th century, there is a major revolution in the West. And of course, he's making reference to the Hildebrand reforms, the Gregorian reforms, the Cluniac reforms. It's just a big movement going on, and a lot of historians just they prounce on this as like this major change for papal self-aggrandizement and self-seeking, lustful popes reaching to the outermost to, take power over everything on heaven and earth. But there's some background that needs to be seen so that we can contextualize this. People who are familiar with church history understand that by this time, in the 10th century going into the 11th century, you had a major upheaval in the West that didn't take place in the East, at least to the degree that it was in the West, and that is basically the lay control of the church. People in academia will just refer to this as lay investiture, simony, and things of this nature. Alongside that, there was issues of sexual immorality in the clergy because of secular power over the church. But basically, lay investiture paved the way for some of the reforms, not revolution necessarily, but the reforms that took place in the 11th century under the famous Pope Gregory VII, Saint Gregory VII. And lay investiture is basically the idea that the kings, the feudal lords, the princes, and the people with a lot of money and political power really take charge over who becomes bishop, who becomes priest, who gets church property, who's going to guarantee a family of priests. And eventually you get all these lay appointees that take control over entire lands, entire monasteries and churches and cathedrals. And so they end up trying to sort of take over the business of the church. And several people saw this coming from afar. It took time for good theologians and canonists to start really taking up pen to address the matter. And this is what we call the reforms. The Gregorian reform was basically to return, not revolt, but return the power of the church to the church. And so Rome, obviously being the first see, like all good Byzantines know, takes the responsibility of recalibrating the structure of the church in the West. And so you have this resurgence of canon law, new collectios, new collections of canon law, and vigorous argumentation for why the church needs to be run by the church without lay interference. And so one of the ways of doing that is to emphasize the divine nature of church government that doesn't depend on, doesn't require, and cannot be handled by kings and princes and feudal lords. And so naturally, part of the divine institution of the church is the papacy. And so you get this very massive resurgence of papal claims in Pope Gregory VII, but he himself is relying on Ambrose of Milan, Pope Gregory I, Pope Leo the Great. Yes, he was using the false decretals, but a lot of the content from those decretals were not even in dispute by the Greeks. A lot of the content in the some people get this idea about the false decretals that every single line was somehow meant to be aiding and feeding this growing appetite of papal power. Some of those statements in the false decretals just said that a bishop has to be elected by the church, or that a priest, if he has a problem with a bishop, can appeal to the metropolitan. Just some basic things that everyone agrees with, right? So sometimes historians, they'll use, false decretals, and then it's like it kind of warps the mind into this, this papal monstrosity. But that's not necessarily what was always going on. Now, yes, there was this, I want to call it sort of a raising of the roof claim by Pope Gregory VII, absolute temporal jurisdiction over everything. But even when you look into the details of that, the emperors, because Seraphim made mention of this, of how we're dealing with popes that claim to depose emperors and to absolve subjects from their obligations towards the civil power. But understand that an emperor is a baptized member of the Catholic Church, and if in his exercise of lordship he interferes with religious affairs, he necessarily comes under the due punishment and discipline of the church. I mean, after all, in that area, where was the ecclesiastical sphere that was different from the political sphere? There was no, like, here's this and here's this other thing. It was all mixed together. And so an emperor going haywire and making up new church rules for Germany, France, England, whatever it is, he's hitting the hornet's nest of the church. And so the church is going to respond with its own weapons. And so can a pope depose an emperor or a king if that king in his administration is part and parcel with his order is changing all of the apostolic institutions of the church? Well, if that was going on in Byzantium, what would the Greeks have done? And I think they would have done something very similar to the Gregorian reforms. They couldn't just say, well, we're going to keep going back to we're going to unwind the Byzantine Symphonia. We're going to go back to the church. We'll go back to hiding in caves and hiding under the trees, and we'll leave all these Christian rulers as heretics separate. No, I think the church would have sought a different emperor to take over, most likely. But there would have been this reclaim for the church's sovereign rights over religion. So Gregorian reform isn't a firecracker that just starts off for the Pope. You've got this lay control going all over the place, and the Pope is trying to return the church's control to the church. The papacy is obviously the head of the church, and so he has this principal role in doing that. Okay, we'll put that aside. Just one or two more points. There was this event that happened in 1024. So we're getting, still in the beginning of the 11th century, but we're getting closer to the end of the beginning of the 11th century. Patriarch of Constantinople, Eustathius. He's a saint in the Orthodox Church today, venerated, I think, in May. And he, together with the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, I believe, made a proposal to Pope John XIX. Yeah, 19th. And that proposal was, as a way to maintain communion, if the Pope would recognize the Patriarch of Constantinople to be universal within his sphere, just as the Roman Pontiff is universal in the whole universe, that we could maintain communion on those grounds. And Pope John the 19th was in favor of this, because in his mind, if you're going to admit that I have jurisdiction over the universe and you have jurisdiction over the East, that seems like a deal, right? But some of the reformers, that contributed to the reform of lay control in the West, in Italy and France, had problems with this, and so they counseled the Pope not to go along with this proposal. And so the Pope ended up saying, no, we're not going to go with that compromise or that concession. We're going to maintain our absolute jurisdiction over the universe. But what we can do is we can recognize the jurisdiction of the Greek Metropolitan of Bari in southern Italy, and you can have 12 suffragans, and you can have your own little church there in southern Italy, amongst other places. And that was agreed to. So you have a saint in the 11th century in Constantinople who was well aware of the papal claims. And so I'm just trying to harken back. Seraphim is talking about how this is just absolutely unacceptable, right? Well, yes or no. I mean, we have instances where papal claims are made. Byzantine saints in Constantinople are aware of it, and they're still working with it, and they don't want to break communion, even with those claims being clearly made. So that was, that's an important point about this 11th century revolution, the claim about that. What else did I have to say about that? There's some more things we could say. I don't think we need to go into those things. I'll let the other two guys go, and we'll circle back to the issue of the schism in the 11th century.
Sure. Elijah, do you have anything to add?
I do, but if Ben wants to go ahead.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, that was a great presentation on the Gregorian reforms. One thing that stood out to me from Seraphim's claim was he didn't outright say this, but the implication of this point he's making is essentially that the Catholics and Orthodox before the schism, before the 11th century, they had some kind of agreed way of viewing the papacy that was acceptable. right? And then the 11th century happens, and there's this revolution in the papacy's self-understanding. I think that's an important phrase that Seraphim uses, right? That the way that the papacy understands itself is what Seraphim claims was revolutionized in the 11th century, such that after the 11th century, now we have something vastly different from what was believed by the Roman Church before the 11th century, right? And I was a little surprised to see him make this claim because, from my reading of the sources, and I think, everyone here, it seems that there is not a whole lot of difference between, say, the 8th century Roman Church and how the papacy of the 8th century understood itself versus the papacy of the 11th century, right? Or, papacy of the 9th century. Like, I don't think Pope St. Nicholas I and Pope St. Gregory VII would have had radically different ideas about what the papacy is up to in, the 9th versus the 11th centuries. And, we can go down the list of citations, obviously going all the way back, I would argue, even to at the Council of Ephesus, right, the profession of faith made by Philip the Legate there, where he talks about this divine institution of the papacy enduring until the end of time. Right. And so sure, maybe there were specifics about the papacy and papal power that were elucidated or further developed during the Gregorian reforms. However, the actual point of contention about the papacy between Catholics and Orthodox is not what was revolutionized in the Gregorian reforms. And yet I believe that seems to be what Seraphim was implying, was not just that there was this revolution in how the papacy understood itself, but specifically that this revolution is such that it constitutes the difference between, the Orthodox and heterodox view of the papacy, according to Eastern Orthodox standards, right? And hopefully that's clear, but what I mean by that is basically the way Seraphim worded this is it's as if, what Rome believed about herself before the 11th century is perfectly acceptable to Eastern Orthodoxy today, and yet what she believed afterwards is completely abhorrent. And yet that's not what we see in the sources, right? What we see in writers like Pope Hadrian I at the 7th Ecumenical Council, Pope St. Agatho at the 6th Ecumenical Council, even the writings of Pope Saints Leo, Pope St. Gelasius, right, back in the 5th century, I believe, we see claims that do indeed logically entail papal infallibility. We see this idea that Christ did in the person of Blessed Peter that explains why the Roman Church is free from heresy, why the Roman Church is the head of the Church by divine appointment, and will be so until the end of time. Right, we see this also repeated in Byzantine sources like St. Theodore the Studite, right, in his letters to Pope St. Paschal the First, right, references this idea of the perpetual endurance of the papacy until the end of time by the promise of Peter, right? If I didn't know, much about these historical subjects, and I heard Seraphim Hamilton's claim here, I would think that, before the 11th century, I won't see anything coming out of the Church of Rome that talks about a perpetual successor of Peter by divine appointment until the end of time, right? That is what I would be thinking if I didn't know the sources. And so once again, I'm not saying that that's necessarily what Hamilton was claiming, but that's definitely how it sounded. And I think that the weakness in using that kind of rhetoric is that to those who are familiar with the sources, it just is a little bit of a weak point to say that there's a lack of continuity between the pre-11th century and post-11th century papacy. So hopefully that kind of is coherent. So.
Yeah, and Ben, I don't disagree with anything you said at all. I think when you were talking, I was just like, hallelujah, praise God. Anyway, sorry, not to bring in my Baptist roots into this conversation. But yeah, I mean, to be fair, though, to Seraphim, I'm sure, I was actually surprised that the video was only 49 something minutes long. Because knowing Seraphim and just his thoroughness, it could have gone so much longer. So I think he was kind of doing the, if people still know this, the Spark Notes version. But still, nonetheless, you are making a valid point that there was a narrative kind of being constructed. And the narrative, I did think, was kind of not intentionally misleading, but it has that potential. And on top of that, I've been saying this for years now after knowing you guys, I think the debate now is not were the papal claims made in the first millennium. I mean, we just have to deal with that fact. And the question is, what do we do with those facts? Right. And then we have to deal with, some embarrassing moments here and there. Okay, we're going to get to those later. We've done those conversations elsewhere. But I feel like the debate needs to really, fundamentally shift in a certain way. because I think the hard work has been done by people like Elijah, Erick, and Ben, and whatever drops in the bucket I've given to showing that okay, there's something going on here with the papacy that's more than just not making the papal claims. Anyway, Elijah, you wanted me to pull up the video, and I can do that for you. First timestamp. You just want to walk us through what's going on here?
Yeah. So it's talking about, I think, the issues that we're covering right now. It's on the Filioque, but I do want to quote him directly because he says that the East had issues with the Filioque going back centuries, and I think that was an interesting thing. So if you play that, it actually he's actually admitting that the West taught it. So at that point, if the West taught it, then the East had issues with it, then it's no longer a universally accepted teaching one way or another. So now you have an issue where the church is split on this, right? So I'll get into a little bit more, but if you can play that clip.
Yeah, and just let me know if you can hear it on your end, just to make sure that no technical difficulties.
Sure.
All right, I'll get started.
Much stronger prima facie case that Rome is the one who broke the covenant. Another example was, with the Filioque. It's an objective datum of history that the East had a major problem with the Filioque going back centuries. It's also an objective datum of history that Rome agreed to not add it into the creed because of that. That was the deal, right? We're going to remain in communion. That's the consensus, because we're not going to put it in the creed. And we all know Pope Leo III, he engraves the creed without the Filioque on these stela. And people can say, well, he believed it as doctrine, but he didn't put it in the creed. People can debate the particulars of it. But what I'm more interested in is, what's the big picture here? The big picture seems to be that both East and West recognized that adding the Filioque to the creed was a red line. The West acknowledged it as a red line and acted accordingly. And then in the 11th century, for whatever reason, Rome decided that it was going to alter the terms of the deal.
You can stop it there.
The creed and the schism.
So he basically admits that the East had issues, major issues with it, which implies that the West taught it before the schism, right? Going back centuries. So, and I don't think this is disputed by scholars. I think scholars would say it was taught by the West. I'm not arguing that it was only taught by the West. I'm just using that argument and bringing it to the table and saying, all right, let's assume the argument is that the East disputed it, and therefore the West taught it because they're disputing something from someone, and that's the West. So if that's the case, then it wasn't a universal teaching according to Seraphim's admittance here. So, and I just want to point something out here, because I think a lot of times folks in the East almost want to assume that if the East taught it, then it's universal. And if the West taught it, and if the East rejected it, then it's an opinion. That's not what they are. That's not what they would say, but it's almost like subconsciously. That's how they're looking at it. It's Eastern superiority. So if the West believed it and it was just an opinion, right? How else would one take that? But if the West taught the Filioque and the East rejected it, well, that rejection is in and of itself a dogma, because they're teaching something, right? They're not just rejecting the Father and the Son, the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, I should say. They're accepting a dogma that says the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone, right? But why should that be the rule of faith if it only comes from one part of the church and not the other, right? Again, I'm not saying that the East did not teach the Filioque. I'm just using his argument here to show that there is a problem by saying that the East had issues with it. Well, the West had issues with the other side. That's what I would bring to the table. So if it works to say the East had issues with it, then why doesn't it work to say the West had issues with not teaching the Filioque? And of course, there are two issues here. One is, do we include it in the creed? And the other one is it a true dogma or not? So that's basically what I wanted to talk about there. There was another timestamp I told you to play, Suan, but you can ignore that because I just covered both. But if folks want to hear it in the if they're watching this in the future. It's 1025 to 1122. I covered that as well on what I just said. So.
Yeah, and by the way, guys, feel free to just hop in, naturally.
Yeah, I wanted to add
Yeah.
something. I wanted to add something to what Elijah's saying is going back to this issue of that everyone agrees that in the 11th century there's a revolution going on in the West. Okay, and that claim is what he was using to illustrate discontinuity between pre-11th century Rome and 11th century Rome, right? But here's the thing. The climactic severance between East and West, and anybody who's done the research on this knows that 1054 is not that, but that's just the symbolic date because some of the tensions between the Greeks and the Latins come up in flare, right? So, but when Pope Leo the Ninth, Pope Saint Leo the Ninth, who comes, he's the same kind of pope that Seraphim would say is a Gregorian reformer, right? Leo the Ninth's complaints against the Greeks had nothing to do with a dispute over primacy. If you guys, you and the listeners, I know you guys know this, but the listeners, Pope Leo the Ninth, he dispatched a legation, I think it was 3 guys, to Constantinople. One of them, the famous Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, I think. And the famous story is that there was no cooperation when they got to the Church of Constantinople. They stormed into Hagia Sophia, slammed the bull of excommunication on the high altar, and then stormed out. Well, if you read the bull of excommunication from Leo the Ninth, it's claimed to be under the authority of Leo the Ninth, but it's really from Humbert. The first thing that he complains about is that there's simony in the East. Not in the East. This is important. He doesn't condemn the Greeks. He condemns Michael Carolarius. And he says Michael Carolarius is in support of simony, castration of clerics, rebaptism. He accused them of having an invalid Eucharist because there's enzymes. Because the Greeks were denying that the Latin churches in Constantinople had a valid Eucharist because they used enzymes. Humbert accuses the Greeks of deleting the Filioque from the creed, for which he was wrong, right? But so it was the issue of enzymes on leavened bread, Filioque, issues having a clean shaven face was a point that the Greeks were condemning. So when you actually have 11th century Rome and 11th century Constantinople locking horns, nobody's saying Gregory the Seventh. What they're saying is your doctrine of the Holy Spirit, you shave your faces, all these things. And then when Carolarius responded to Cardinal Humbert, he reserves it for just, a few things. The Filioque, I think unleavened bread, and that it's okay for priests to get married and to continue, which is funny because Carolarius said that the priests and the Greek priests don't engage in sexual intercourse with their wives normally. He says they do it at certain times, right? Which is interesting because this is not what really gets talked about today. But Carolarius and Humbert, they're not mentioning anything about the Gregorian reforms. It really comes down to the Filioque and the use of bread, unleavened bread in Mass, and some other things. So that's just something that the listeners deserve to know, that if this Gregorian revolt in the West is this big discontinuity marker, why wasn't that the central discussion? And it wasn't the central discussion because, as I pointed out from St. Eustathius of Constantinople in 1024, they knew what Rome was saying about its power. In fact, they were trying to piggyback on it. So anyway, I thought that was a good point to bring up in addition to Elijah.
Yeah, if I could add something to the whole Filioque creed thing, since that's been brought up, I think you're right to show that, like, that's what Seraphim Hamilton is trying to do, is like spin this narrative about like the Gregorian reforms, the insertion of the Filioque. Like, these are objective, he says, datum of history we can point to and say, look, this is the time of the schism, and these are the things that the West changed, and these are the issues that the East and the West disputed over. And so, he doesn't say, therefore, Eastern Orthodoxy, but he refers to this as very strong prima facie evidence that, okay, maybe the Orthodox are worth giving, the upper hand just, when you hit the ground running, like right off the bat. The Orthodox get the upper hand because, the West is the one who's changed. So it kind of puts Catholicism like on the defensive right away. It's like, I think that is the kind of argumentative strategy that Seraphim is going for. And it's a brilliant one. I appreciate it. I think it's a powerful one. But I think one thing that's worth pointing out with the Filioque controversy is, he brings up, was it Pope St. Leo III, I forget it's like second or third, but he, engraves the original creed without the Filioque on the tablets and says, look, this is a time when Rome refused to insert the Filioque into the creed. There's I guess I could call him a friend of mine, Nathaniel McCollum. Erick, you had a show with him, I believe a year ago at this point. And he kind of like rocked my world a little bit when he explained like the real history of the creeds and such things. And I think it's just really worth, getting that information out there. Something he points out is that in the West, there was no liturgical creed really ever without the Filioque. Right. And so what happens in the 11th century is not Rome inserting the Filioque into the creed. In fact, what Rome agreed to, when Rome agreed not to add the Filioque to the creed, right, we have to keep in mind there's different kinds of creeds, right? There's like creeds that come out of church councils. There's creeds that are used during the Mass. There's creeds that are used at baptism. Each of these creeds has a different function. Rome at the time didn't even have a creed being read out during Mass. And so when Rome agrees not to add the Filioque to the creed, they're not thinking, we're not going to sing the Filioque during Mass. Like they're not saying the creed at all. And in fact, what Pope St. Leo III does is he wants to remove not just the Filioque from the creed, he wants to remove the creed from the liturgy altogether, right? That's his ultimate end goal, right? He wants, because it's, Charlemagne trying to imitate the Byzantine emperor by putting the creed into the Mass. And Leo wants none of that. He's like, how about we just have no creed during Mass at all? And in fact, Leo himself obviously will go on to affirm that the Filioque is a necessary belief, a belief necessary for salvation. And so what actually happens in the 11th century is Rome finally adopts the creed into the Mass, I believe at the request of some king who wanted to be, he was getting anointed as king or something to that effect, and he wanted the creed sung out at his appointment Mass. And there was only one creed in the West that was in liturgical use at the time, and that was the creed with the Filioque. And so I think that just that context is necessary for when we look at, who actually like broke continuity. Because it's interesting, Erick, that you bring up Leo IX accusing the Greeks of taking the Filioque out of the creed. I don't think they were just like, knowingly lying. Like the Filioque had been so part of the Western heritage in terms of liturgical creeds, the only liturgical creed, with maybe like one exception that we know of, the only liturgical creed to exist in the West has the Filioque in it. And so when the Latins are looking at the Greeks who don't have the Filioque in their liturgical creed, they had every reason to think that maybe they had taken it out, right? They were actually saying that in good faith. And so one point that Nathaniel brought up in your discussion with him, Erick, was that to ask the West to remove the Filioque from the creed today, right, would be to break with the consistent practice of the West's liturgical tradition for all ages, right? So it would actually, so if the Pope were to demand tomorrow every Western church removes the Filioque from the creed, which is what it seems a lot of Orthodox apologists would demand of Rome, that would be to assert papal authority over an organic tradition, a genuine tradition of the Western Church that, you know, did not start with Rome, but that developed organically. And that's just nuance that, unfortunately, in Seraphim's presentation of this, it just sounds like this, you know, abuse of papal power. We're now going back on our word, inserting the Filioque into the creed, when really that's not actually what's going on. So I think that's just worth highlighting.
Yeah, and like Eric, on your sheet, you know, with the different claims you wanted to look at, I think like the next two, including, you know, the one we previously talked about, and then this one here, 4 and 5, I think, are both on the Filioque controversy. Do you want to add anything here, or do you think we could move on to another claim? Or
No, I mean, the only thing I wanted to say about the Filioque issue is that Seraphim said that it's an objective datum of history that the Filioque was a red line that both the East and the West agreed upon, and then the West crossed the line while the East remained the same. Therefore, Rome broke the continuity. But there's some historical issues there. Because what the West and the East agreed to, you know, it's not clear what he's referring to. If he's referring to the Council of Constantinople 879, for example, which I think is what he's probably referring to, that council, it's kind of shrouded in some uncertainty because it doesn't even get numbered by significant representatives on either the Latin or the Greek side for centuries after the 9th century. And so it becomes a question as to what value does that synod have, first of all, right? I mean, Ephesus 431, Nicaea I, Chalcedon, all these councils, whether they had difficulties, tensions, problematic interruptions, whatever you want to pull on top of it, they were all began to be numbered right away as an ecumenical council. So the fact that Constantinople 879, which forbade word additions to the creed, doesn't really get numbered, it becomes, a question as to what value does that have. But, Seraphim will appreciate that in the book, it's called A Successful Council of Union, a theological analysis of the Photian Synod of 879 to 880 by Johann Meyer. This book here is one of the standard English monographs on the Council of 879. And in this book, Meyer makes it clear that the issue at that council was not the doctrine of the Filioque. The Filioque never even comes up. It's rather forbidding additions, which, of course, is inspired by the Filioque edition that was taking place in the West, farther west than Rome. But so what agreement is Seraphim talking about? Is he talking about just the word addition? Well, that's very important to know if that's what he means, just the word addition, because if we're talking about continuity, what we have here is a break in continuity on Rome's side and a bigger break in continuity on the Greek side. And here's why. Because the way that Seraphim painted it was, look, the East just remained the same and the West changed. Well, here's why there's discontinuity on both sides, but the Byzantines took the greater weight of breaking away. And that is, yes, Rome did add the Filioque to the creed. Yes, that was a reversal of its former position, which was to keep the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed as it is. It did add Filioque to the creed, so that is a sense a change. But the way that the Byzantines responded to this was, number one, they said, that's a canonical crime. But really, number 2 was the biggest issue, and that is the Filioque is a heresy. And so they condemned the Filioque as a heresy, and they condemned the Latins as heretics. Now, that's important because all of the Byzantines in the future, and I'll just grab the most significant one for our purposes, Mark of Ephesus, when he was writing, he wrote an encyclical, he wrote a public defense against the union, the false union, all this stuff. He said the following, and I need to read it because this is important as it relates to the claims that Seraphim was making. He says this: if the Latins do not at all depart from the correct faith, we have evidently cut them off unjustly. That's important because so much, you have some scholars today that they understand that this, when it comes to the doctrine of the Filioque, becomes difficult, right? Because Augustine and the Latin theologians. So let's focus more on the canonical criminality of adding to the creed. But that's not what the Greeks believed for what we're now 10 centuries after this. Well, depending on when you date the schism, but the debates over the Filioque, it's about 1,000 years long now. All of the Greeks, when it came to the Filioque, they would have slapped you in the face, if you said that the issue with the Filioque is just a creedal construction matter. For them, it was heresy. So Mark of Ephesus goes on, he says, but if they have thoroughly departed from the faith in the Filioque, and in that connection with the theology of the Holy Spirit, blasphemed against him, whom is the greatest of all perils, then it is clear that they are heretics, and we have cut them off as heretics. If the Latin dogma is true, if it's true that the Holy Spirit proceeds also from the Son, then ours is the false side. So Mark of Ephesus, and then he proceeds to say, it is the Filioque. The Filioque is the precise reason for which we have separated from the Latins. Okay, so Mark of Ephesus is basically saying, if the Filioque is true, the entire Greek project is false. And that's important because if you read Ed Seczynski's book on the Filioque, on his section on Augustine of Hippo, so page, any of the readers, 59 to 63, you go ahead and read it, but if you want to trust me, he basically says that Augustine's clearly a Filioquist. Augustine became the second canon of theological pneumatology. Canon meaning the canon of Scripture. Augustine became like the second canon. His De Trinitate influenced all Latin theologians going forward. And Seczynski says, quote, this is what formed the basis of the Filioque dispute that caused the schism. So that what Seczynski says there would be absolutely unacceptable to Mark of Ephesus, because then Mark of Ephesus would be forced to say that the Latin West, which is filled with the same Holy Spirit, was divergent with the Greek East, and that would mean that the Filioque is true, and it would mean that we have separated from the Latins on something that's incorrect. So that's. I just want to make it clear that yes, there's discontinuity with adding Filioque to the creed. You guys added it to the creed, yes. But there's a bigger discontinuity with then turning around and saying now the Filioque is a heretical teaching, because if the Filioque comes from the lips of Jesus, which is what the Latin theologians all said, then the Greeks just condemned something that came out of the mouth of God.
Yeah. If I could add something to that, I think that is given all the more significance when you consider the fact that the Filioque does not show up in the Creed for the first time in the 11th century, but actually in the 6th century, at least in the Nicene Creed. And if you want to go with the Athanasian Creed, where the Filioque is very explicit as well, dating back to at least the 5th century, I believe is the earliest scholars will put it these days, showing that this was not just like a pet belief of the West, but that they put this into their creeds that they were reading out at baptisms or reaching out to different episcopal bodies, or, during the Mass in those places in the West where the Creed was recited during Mass. Everyone was saying Filioque, in the sense of, not to get too technical theological, but in the sense of, hypostatic procession of the Holy Spirit, because it has that place in the Creed. The Holy Spirit proceeds, referring to only one procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father and the Son. This was part of the creedal confessions. So you could not be in communion with the Western Church before the schism unless you professed the Filioque. Right? Pope St. Leo III, the one who engraves the Creed without the Filioque on the gold tablets, himself explicitly said that, right? As I mentioned, that it's a belief necessary for salvation. And so you're certainly right, Eric, to point out that it is the bigger discontinuity to go from being in communion with people who have these beliefs to then go around and call those same people heretics for not changing even a little bit what they believed about the procession of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, and that's also true with the Athanasian Creed, because that creed was used as a condition to be tonsured and to received in monasteries all throughout Spain and later in England. So we're talking about something that goes so deep into the heart of Latin spirituality.
Yeah, and if I could just say something real quick, I didn't mean, and I'm glad I actually did this, but I didn't mean to get into the Filioque. I was just giving an example of how in the first millennium, you have two different teachings. So why do we assume the East was right by 1054, whatever date you want to put on that? You can take primacy, infallibility, whatever it is. You can apply that to anything. But actually, I'm kind of glad I opened up that can, because what I said in like 3 sentences, Ben and Eric gave you like a book scholarly take on it, which was like actually probably the best point so far that we've had on this. It's been like an hour and 12 minutes. That time flies, but this is probably like the strongest points that both of Ben and Eric are making. So take note of everything you guys are hearing and go back and check what the page numbers and the scholars that they're referencing, because this is excellent stuff.
Yeah. Well, do we want to wrap up and move to the next point on the docket?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Okay. So we're now on number 5, and just basically what kind of primacy did the Pope have in the first millennium? Was he the head of the synod, facilitator for a council, just to kind of maybe get at some titles potentially? Ben, do you want to start this one off?
Yeah, for sure. I've been listening to Seraphim for so long, I sometimes like forget what he says where. So I'm not actually sure if he brings this up in this video, but one of the titles for the Pope that Seraphim likes to really focus on is what's said about Pope St. Leo the Great at the Council of Chalcedon, where he's called the Archbishop of the world, right? And this is something that, Eric, in your discussions with Ubi Petrus, this is something that a lot of Orthodox apologists like to focus on, is that what it means and for the Pope to have a kind of primacy in the church is something like, the kind of primacy that an archbishop has, right? And which is very limited in its scope, right? Like nobody would say that an archbishop has this, universal, immediate, ordinary jurisdiction, not to mention infallible teaching authority and all this other stuff. And so the logic goes that if the Pope's relation to the church is just another manifestation of the authority of an archbishop, except at a universal level, then it follows that Vatican I certainly goes too far in its declaration of the Pope as being all of these things. And so that seems to be the kind of primacy that Seraphim wants to afford to the Roman Church. Because Seraphim, he knows the history. Like, he knows that he can't just say like, oh well, there's no primacy to the Roman Church. That was all just kind of made up, right? Like what a lot of official documents from the Russian Orthodox Church say. Interestingly enough, they see some, even the Encyclical of Eastern Patriarchs has some interesting things to say about denying that there's a primacy even among the apostles. Things that Seraphim Hamilton, knows better than to repeat as his own position. And one of the issues I take, though, with this idea that, well, the Pope is just the Archbishop of the world, he's just another manifestation of that level. I wrote an entire article basically attacking like that very premise, so I could go on and on about it. But the first point that I would really want to is, how is this primacy, right? However we want to define it, before we even get into the specifics of what the extent of the primacy is, what its specific powers entail, the first question we want to ask is, what is the origin of this primacy? Like, where does it come from? Right? Was this an ecclesiastical creation, or was this a divine institution? Because I think as I was watching the video, it seemed like Seraphim Hamilton kind of wanted to evade directly answering that question. Maybe other listeners took away a different impression, but to me it seemed like he kind of didn't directly address that question of, is the papacy, is this primacy in the church a divine institution, right? He kind of wanted to say like, well, in a sense you could speak of the Roman Empire as a divine institution because of divine providence and it's prophesied in scripture and all these things. But he doesn't quite get at the heart of it, which is that in all of the major papal claims, like whether it's at the Council of Ephesus, whether it's at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, Seventh Ecumenical Council, or the writings of the popes we've mentioned, they all seem to locate the origin of this primacy in Christ's appointment of Peter over the apostles. And they say that because Christ created this divine headship, this divine institution of headship over the church, right, that is why it will last until the end of time as the unifier of the church. And such that, if you establish that fact alone, that the papacy is at the head of the church, not because some council got together later or because some fathers, said, well, Peter and Paul's bones are there, so we're going to respect Rome, or it's the imperial city, or even like a convergence of these ideas. But if the reason that the papacy is at the head of the church is because Christ instituted it that way, right? The same way he instituted the bishops to be the successors of the apostles, he instituted the Pope to be the successor of Peter. If that's the case, which is what is explicitly claimed by the West for most of the first millennium, then it really doesn't actually matter a whole lot if how you want to work out the details of, what that primacy looks like in action, if that makes sense. One point I like to bring up a lot is that there's a reason why conciliarists and ultramontanists could coexist in the Catholic Church for hundreds of years, right? There's a reason why even like the staunchest conciliarists didn't like go off and become Eastern Orthodox, right? It's not because they were dumb, but it was because they had nonetheless they had this shared belief, the conciliarists and the ultramontanists, that the papacy is a divine institution. And so even though they had disagreements about the extent of the jurisdiction of the Pope, the infallible teaching authority of the Pope, they could disagree about that. But because they had this core agreement about the papacy being a divine institution and therefore indispensable, that's why they could remain united in the same church even until the 19th century, right? So those are kind of my thoughts on that point. I'll let someone else add to that.
Great points.
Yeah, let me just say, Elijah, do you want me to pull up the video and we could view that timestamp, or maybe we've already passed or gone too far? What do you think?
Well, we haven't gone too far, but you don't have to play it. I mean, he's just talking about what Ben is talking about. So sure. It's very related. So he's talking about the universal headship, how it operates, and he brings up Apostolic Canon 34. But, my question is, the Eastern Orthodox like to bring up Apostolic Canon 34, which says that the head can do nothing without the members, and the members can do nothing without the head, right? So they both need each other in a sense. And I think the context is that the head needs permission from the members being the bishops, and the bishops need permission from the head, who he's kind of applying that to universal, which I might have a problem with that, to say that Apostolic Canon 34 applies to in the universal level. But let's assume the argument is there. What I see from the East is lip service to that, but then Eastern Orthodox apologists will bring up Vigilius and say, well, what happens with Vigilius, right? Well, if you're going to apply Apostolic Canon 34, then Vigilius is necessary for you to have something that's dogmatic or a decree, right? Because the head can do nothing without the body, and the body or members can do nothing without the head. So what are you doing with the head is you're severing it, and you're saying, oh, we can move forward without him. That's not Justinian's thought process. That's just the apologist thought process today. And they think that that's how Justinian's looking at it. But there was a reason why he put him on house arrest and persecuted him and tried to get him to consent, because of this idea that you have to have the Pope signing off on something. And as Erick has mentioned before, the council did not just move forward without him. They moved forward and pretended like Vigilius was on board, right? Like that was like in the Byzantine history. If you look at the 8th century, 9th century Byzantine writers, they're writing about Vigilius as if he's the champion of Orthodoxy, that he was on board the whole time, right? It wasn't like they're saying he was against Justinian and there was this contention. That's not how they're painting the picture, but that's just an apologetics approach from today. And see, the same thing happens with Constantinople I. You'll see Eastern Orthodox will say, well, Rome didn't sign off on that council, and it was known to be ecumenical. Like, okay, so which one is it? Do you need the head or not? Is the Pope the head, and do you need him, or is he absolutely necessary? Or is he just kind of like a recommendation? It's great if we have him, and if not, then it is what it is. And again, same thing. He brings up Canon 28 and how they write to the Pope, and he says the Pope has the right to veto a council or a dogma, but he doesn't have the right to veto a canon or a single canon of a council, Canon 28, right? So if the Pope does not have that right, then what was the point of even asking Pope Leo if he should sign off on Canon 28 or not? I mean, that's just wasting time. What is the point of that? If his veto does nothing to Canon 28, then why are you even asking him in the first place? So those are just my thoughts. And if folks want to listen to that timestamp, it's 1540 to 1754. I know we're kind of running out of time, so we don't want to be playing all these timestamps. And then I'll pass that on to you, Suan or Erick.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add here, Erick. I think, do you want to kind of close out this maybe, or do you just want to add anything?
Well, I mean, I had a few slides on that had quotations from the first millennium, in addition to Orthodox scholars who made concessions, but I think it might take too much time. But what I can say is this, that Vigilius is one of the popes that Seraphim Hamilton said is the most, it presents the most difficulty for the Catholic side, because you got a council and a pope basically in the ring, and the Pope gets knocked out. So it's, that's kind of that's the scenery, that's the trailer that the Orthodox put on display for everybody to hear. But it's actually not accurate, because first of all, the sections in the council that excommunicate Pope Vigilius end up being deleted from the final edition of the Acts. Secondly, when Pope Vigilius comes around to agreeing to the anathema of the 3 chapters, because that's what the whole question was about, he doesn't. What the Orthodox like to say, what the Protestants like to say, is that Vigilius repented on his knees, submitted to the council, said that Satan inspired him, and that he's just this returning penitent, eager to be forgiven and received by the church. Well, that's not what the scholarship shows. I mean, Father Richard Price is the one who translated so much the acts of this council and did much of the commentary. And he says, no, Vigilius actually comes around and takes over the question of the 3 chapters. He doesn't even recognize the authority of what the Greek bishops did in Constantinople. It's as if it's still a live question. So when he writes his letter to Eutychius of Constantinople and he writes his second constitution, it's like he's sort of like doing a whole ecumenical council of his own. And he never admits that he was a heretic. Not ever. Never admits that he was a heretic throughout the process. You know, some people say, "Oh, but he said he was wrong. He appealed to Augustine's, his retractations and this and that." But the nature of what he was admitting was being misled on historical facts, not on the question of Nestorian versus Chalcedonian Christology. For that matter, Vigilius was absolutely clear that he had been Ephesine and Chalcedonian from the beginning to the end. And then the other thing is this, that if Vigilius is a case where a pope gets knocked out by the Greeks never used that rocket launcher in the future debates. When we get to the iconoclastic controversy in the 8th century, for example, Ben brought up Theodore the Studite. We could talk about Nicephorus of Constantinople. Here's a monograph. Seraphim actually knows about this. The Ecclesiology of Saint Nicephorus I. These guys were using the papacy to defend the legitimacy of venerating icons against the imperial project, which was to basically condemn iconology and to promote iconoclasm. And one of the things that Nicephorus, Theodore the Studite, Stephen the Younger, and all these other Byzantines were saying is the Apostolic See was neglected in the Council of Hieria. You don't have Rome on your side. You don't have Peter on your side. You need the Apostolic See, all the divine customs, all the laws, everything from the fathers told us we need Rome. What? The iconoclast can just say, "Hello, Vigilius. The Greeks knocked the Pope out then. We can knock him out now." And we don't see that. And so Vigilius, this whole thing of Vigilius being an absolute defeater actually gets forgotten by Latin and Greek history. And, we could talk more about this another time, but, Seraphim brought up the issue of the Photian schism where the Byzantines broke communion from Rome. But we can't forget that Rome condemned people who said that anyone can judge Rome in Constantinople. That was the Council of 869. And nobody was required to recant that at all. And so Vigilius doesn't come up. If anybody came up, it was Honorius, and it was the popes who brought him up. I do think Photius brought up Vigilius at the Council of 869. I can't remember precisely, but so that's just what I want to say about, sometimes these haymakers come out, and all due respect to Seraphim Hamilton, he's doing it in good faith. I'm glad he's the one doing it, but we do have to recognize that there is the heat of the sun when it comes to the history.
Yeah, Eric, for the sake of time, and I'm just trying to figure out, I think maybe the next 30 minutes, if we can finish maybe our main portion, or do you want to try to finish the whole episode in the next 30 minutes? Eric, what's your timetable?
So I'm good when it comes to time, but I'm pretty sure we can try to knock out some more things. We don't need to. We can try to go real fast. We can try to go real fast with the. You want to, bring up, 6, 7, 8, 9. We can kind of like just quickly address it.
Yeah. Ben, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, I have something about number 7. I thought that was an interesting one. And I think it kind of like ties in with a bunch of the things we're talking about.
Yeah, so basically, I'm just going to give us all like free reign on at least. I think a lot of stuff with Vigilius is going to come up, and just popes being heretical, supposedly.
Yeah.
And then and then we can. Oh, okay, let's see here. There's some other things here, but let's focus on that right now. Yeah. So, yeah, Ben, go right ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the interesting points, like I mentioned at the beginning, Seraphim has like that Seraphim flair. Like he kind of like phrases things, puts things in a way that like, oh, I had to like stop and think about that. One of those that came up for me was he mentioned that, when Pope Honorius is anathematized at the Sixth Ecumenical Council as a heretic, which I do think that's what's happened. Some Catholic apologists try to say like, oh, he wasn't actually heretic, but like, I mean, he's on the list with all the major heretics. Like, it's pretty clear that's what's going on there. And this could be applied to the Vigilius situation as well. What he says is that nobody at the time thought of that as a theological conundrum, right? Like, if you were to do that, like, he gives the example, like if that were to happen in like, say 1500, somebody in ecumenical council, like calls even a dead Pope a heretic, that at least would have raised questions among theologians of like, is that even possible, right? Like, whereas he says before the schism, right, a Pope gets, a council at least, apparently tries to judge Pope Vigilius. A council condemns Pope Honorius as a heretic, and nobody's really raising the ecclesiological question of like, is that even possible? Is that even a thing? More so the case in the case of Honorius. Obviously, with Pope Vigilius, he did not think that was a thing. But I thought that was an interesting point. And of course, he's using that in the context of, the claim being made by Saint Agatho at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, this claim to infallibility, right? He says, well, if the Council Fathers really did think that Agatho was claiming this level of infallibility and that all of his predecessors were free from heresy, if they really took him seriously, wouldn't there have been questions raised about a pope being condemned as a heretic? I just think it's an interesting thing to bring up, because Seraphim kind of just leaves it at that and just uses that to suggest, he doesn't outright say this, but he uses that to suggest that, well, maybe that's just not what St. Agatho meant. Maybe that's just not really how the Council Fathers understood Agatho. Maybe the Eastern tradition really just didn't understand or accept this understanding of papal infallibility that's being put out by Pope St. Agatho. And essentially the sole basis for holding this position is just that nobody brought up the apparent conundrum. And the point that just immediately came to my mind is, just because nobody brings up the conundrum doesn't actually mean that there isn't one there, right? Like, if you read the text of Pope St. Agatho's writings, like, he makes some pretty strong claims. Like, he doesn't just, use some flowery language about how Rome is like pristine and Orthodox. Like, he's giving you an interpretation of Luke 22. And he's saying when Jesus spoke to Peter and said, your faith shall not fail because of my prayer for you, what he was actually doing was ensuring that, the apostolic pontiffs of Rome would be free from heresy until the end of time. And he also uses this to explain why the Roman See has been free from heresy up until that point, right? That's the claim being made by Agatho. And so the fact that there is a condemnation of a pope as a heretic at the same council is a real conundrum, whether or not people at that point recognize it or not. And so the point that I'm just trying to make now is that understanding of papal infallibility was understood by the East, which you see in writers like St. Theodore the Studite, most explicitly in Theodore Abukura, who I think is a very interesting case. Eric, you just did a video on Theodore, which is an excellent presentation. People should watch that. But what Theodore does is he actually appeals to the same text, Luke 22, that Pope St. Agatho does. And he interprets it in the exact same way that Pope St. Agatho does, namely as referring to the personal infallibility of the faith of Peter and his successors in the Church of Rome. And so the question that would come to my mind is, where is, this Eastern Syrian theologian getting this idea from? Like, where's he even coming up with this stuff? It's clearly from, teachings like those coming out of St. Agatho. And so that clearly represents that's how the East understood these teachings as affirming papal infallibility. And yet Theodore, he doesn't say, oh, but there's this conundrum with Pope Honorius, and so let me explain to you this conundrum that exists. No, he too seems to just ignore the fact that there's a conundrum, right? Obviously, the popes themselves, even after Agatho, will continue to profess this belief in the infallibility of the Roman See, and yet they don't address this conundrum. Erick, do you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to say that Vigilius. Oh, am I on mute?
No, you're good.
No, okay. Vigilius was just a heretic 100 years before Honorius, right?
Right.
That, of course, that didn't make it into the record. I don't think. I don't even think Agatho took notice of that. But, yeah, he brings up the issue of flower language. That it's got to be flower language, because if they say that the See of Rome will never err to the end, and then we've got a heretical pope, it's obvious that they were just sort of, it's like when Mike Tyson entered into the ring years after his first loss with Buster Douglas. People were still saying, Tyson, you're unbeatable. There's this lively energy, and Seraphim was saying, well, this is the See of Peter. They didn't know that there was going to be a great schism in a few hundred years later. So they felt comfortable using this language, but that doesn't fit with his story about Vigilius, because the Vigilius episode, that's like a famous failure. So that doesn't make sense of the motivations as to why Agatho and all these other Greeks would talk about the indefectibility and the perpetual infallibility of Rome. And the other thing is, if it's flowery language, what in the world does the flowery language mean? If the language is saying that from this point to the end of time, Rome is the rock of the true faith. I mean, let's say it is a big flower. What does the big flower mean then? Because if it means, well, he's just really good, like Rome's just really good, then that means that it's basically just like any other See. It could pass or fail just like any other See, in which case it becomes a meaningless flowery language that really doesn't have any meaning. And so I think that's the worst option. I think that if you read the concrete claims, these claims are being made, and there are Orthodox scholars out there that refuse to write this off as flowery language, even guys like Father Georgius Florovsky. His commentary on the Sixth Council, he's like, yeah, Agatho claims to be infallible here. That comes from other Orthodox. I've heard Protestant scholars admit that. If we want to get some expert linguist in the Greek Byzantine culture, and you might be able to squeeze something poetic out.
Suggestion.
Or a suggestion, yeah. But I think we're stretching. We're going on a thin limb.
Yeah. Does anyone want to add anything? Because I was thinking about going into just some specific points that Seraphim brought up, if
Sure.
that's all right. Yeah. So Seraphim brought up how can Rome be necessary and sufficient for an ecumenical council if Lateran 649 was not ecumenical? I think, Erick, you touched on that a little bit earlier, but there's that one. And then I guess I'll throw in a related one just, for the sake of time. How can the Seventh Council be considered ecumenical if Pope Hadrian I did not ratify it? 2-for-1 deal there.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on those.
Go ahead.
That works. With Lateran 649, I think that is an interesting case. But I would kind of want to back up before getting into that specific cases of what about Lateran 649 and what about the Seventh Ecumenical Council. I would want to look at, okay, what are the theories of ecumenical councils that are being proposed? What are the theories that we have on the table that we're actually comparing here? Because as far as I understand it, even according to Seraphim Hamilton, right, the definition of an ecumenical council is when the head and the members, universally referring to Rome and the Eastern and the other, patriarchal sees, come together in council and universally agree on something. That's what makes an ecumenical council, right? That's Seraphim Hamilton's theory. So right off the bat, right, that would mean that if there is a council where Rome's assent is not present, then it's not an ecumenical council by everybody's standards, right? And the Catholic Church as well, right? It's not as if we have this belief. Eric, you used this imagery a long time ago that like the Pope can call 3 guys into his office and say, we've had an ecumenical council now that we've made this judgment, right? Like an ecumenical council actually means something in Catholic theology too. And it's a similar concept where you have the worldwide episcopate coming together, right? With head and members together, and they make this ruling. And that is what we call an ecumenical council. Now, in the case of Lateran 649, was it this universal synod where everybody comes together? I'm actually not too sure about the specifics with who was there. I know Jerusalem was represented there. I'm not sure if I'm not sure if every patriarchal see was represented there, but if not, then that would be why nobody considers an ecumenical council. And if it is, and if it was, then the fact that it's not considered an ecumenical council is a problem for everybody. So I don't really see where this line of reasoning exactly leads to. I would say for Catholics, we would say that the judgment of Pope St. Martin at Lateran 649 would fall in the realm of papal infallibility, right? He's issuing anathemas, teaching the faith. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, something does not have to be an ecumenical council in order for it to be, enveloped under papal infallibility, papal authority. I would say a similar thing happens in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, because something to keep in mind is that in the West, there were already papal judgments about icon veneration in the West that happened before the Seventh Ecumenical Council. I believe I have an article on my website about it. I have to look the specific citations. But basically in the West, but in Rome's perspective, this was already a settled issue, right? They had already rendered papal judgments about icon veneration. And so they didn't really see the need for there to be an ecumenical council, other than to enforce this policy in the East, obviously to address the iconoclast controversy. And so in my reading, it seems like with Nicaea II not being regarded as an ecumenical council, it's not as if the West all of a sudden just thought that, papal infallibility wasn't a thing, that their judgments were not authoritative. Rather, they viewed Nicaea II as addressing a specific Eastern problem, and Rome was dealing with this problem in the West. They'd already settled this, decades before. So I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that, but those are kind of where my mind went on those points.
Yeah. Elijah, did you have anything to say?
That's actually exactly how I think about 649. You can go ahead, Eric. I'll add to you after that. But those are great points, Ben.
Okay, well, I just want to, I really want to add this because Seraphim said, where in the first millennium do we see anybody saying, let's get Rome to resolve a theological conflict? And it was amazing because that is precisely what we see in Lateran 649. Maximus the Confessor, Sophronius of Jerusalem, his main archbishop or priest, I can't remember, Stephen of Dor, were all seeking out Rome's decree on the issue of monothelitism. And Seraphim's like, well, where do they do this? And why do they seek out Rome? Well, Maximus seeks out Rome, and he gives a very specific set of reasons. And those reasons are Matthew 16, John 20:21, and Luke 23.
Peterson.
Basically that God in the flesh made certain promises to the universal church, yes, but in a unique way, funneled down to the Roman church, which he says presides over the world like the sun. And once Rome makes a judgment, Maximus takes it as an ecumenical council. Let's just observe the facts, guys. Let's get out of the question for a second. When Maximus was interrogated on why he doesn't agree with the monothelites, Maximus says because they disagree with the 6 councils. But there was only 5 ecumenical councils at that point. So that means that according to Seraphim Hamilton's own query, where do we see anybody in the first millennium seeking out a definitive judgment from Rome? We have it in the life and the career of Maximus himself, and he gives the reasons for why. And what's interesting is that, Ben made some good points about the conundrum of heretical Rome versus the promises that are claimed in the papal claims. Maximus also is an example of this conundrum, because when Maximus was captured in the East and he was poked and prodded and interrogated, eventually they came to him and said, even Rome agrees with the monothelites. What are you going to do now, Maximus? And the Orthodox love this situation, because Maximus says, even if the whole world were to be monothelite, I will not be monothelite, right? So they put a period there. But they don't read some of the letters that Maximus wrote to his disciples. And one of those letters, there's an addition that's is a coda that's added at the end of the line by an Anastasius, one of Maximus's disciples, which says we need to inquire over what's happening in Rome to see if the promises of Jesus are verified. Why would they say that? That sounds like they recognize the conundrum to me. In any case, Lateran 649 was a Roman synod. There was just Italian bishops. There was Sophronius's representative, Stephen of Dore, but Sophronius had died already. There was no Patriarch of Jerusalem. That was the whole reason why Stephen of Dore went to this Lateran synod, Roman synod. This is held in Rome. Is that the East was vacant? Like, they were all in darkness over this issue. So it was basically just an Italian synod. And Rome did take it as a definitive judgment. Yes, Pope Martin did ratify it as a universal judgment, not as an ecumenical council. That's why when the Sixth Ecumenical Council is called, right? Because the Orthodox are going to say, Lateran 649, we still needed 681, right? Well, when 681 was convened, Rome had no interest. Like, it wasn't an interest for Rome. It was only because Emperor Constantine IV said, we need to get a mop and clean up the entire East with this monothelite problem. So we need to reach out to the successor of Peter. So Rome didn't say, hey guys, we only have half the ecumeny agreeing with diotheletism. We need the other half to agree to make this ecumenical. No, Rome said, Agatho's letter, and basically said, look, we already decided upon this issue. It's y'all's job to agree with it. So Lateran Council actually does have infallible value. And Agatho made that pretty clear in his letter. But he never ratified it as an ecumenical council. There's no evidence of that.
Yeah, Eric, do you want to touch on just the question of Nicaea II real quick?
Oh, yeah, Nicaea II. Yeah. It's interesting because Ben brought up a really good point that the veneration of images, that was something that was basically settled in Rome by Gregory II. I mean, way back in the 700s, like in the early 700s. So the Council of Nicaea II, Pope Hadrian, his concerns at the time were not so much the images, right? It was getting back the money from the tithes from the jurisdiction of Rome's churches in southern Italy, I think Calabria, Sicily, and then also in the Illyrian Peninsula. Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian, confiscated that from Rome and illegally put it into the hands of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So Hadrian said, look, you guys are good on images. I've written a whole defense on that from head to toe from the fathers, but the emperor's got to give us back the jurisdiction over southern Italy and the Illyrian churches, right? The Orthodox say, if the Pope had universal jurisdiction, then why is he asking the Okay, the reason why is because a Pope doesn't have an army to take out the military that is defending what the emperor did in southern Italy and in the Illyrian churches, right? He's trying to do this in a way that conforms to the peace of Christ. So Hadrian said, I will ratify this council as ecumenical as soon as I get all those territories back. But the Byzantines, the emperor, whatever reason, they didn't give Rome back those territories. So Rome actually only supported the doctrinal aspect of that council, did not ratify it as ecumenical. It's interesting, Seraphim Hamilton said that the East saw it as ecumenical. That's not true. A lot of the people in the East were iconoclasts, number one, so they didn't accept it. But even those that were iconodules, like Theodore the Studite, we have a statement in his writings where he denies the ecumenicity of the council because Rome did not ratify. That also comes up in the book, The Ecclesiology of Nicephorus. You could also get it in this Oxford monograph called the Patriarch of Nicephorus on the image controversy. I'll give it to you later on a link. Maybe you could put it in the show notes. But Theodore the Studite actually had to contend with this claim that Rome didn't ratify. He says, okay, maybe Rome didn't ratify it. Maybe it's not ecumenical. You know what Theodore the Studite said? He said, it doesn't matter if it's not ecumenical. You know why? Because we rest our certainty on the promises of Jesus Christ given to St. Peter and his successor, who has written a letter to defend the veneration of images. So even when the iconoclasts were able to tee off on this fact that Rome did not ratify Nicaea II, you have an iconodule saint in the Orthodox Church saying, okay, maybe that's true. We still are certain about the veneration of images because of this divine promise. Not a time to bring up flowery language. This is a time to bring up a settled, certain fact. Of course, we have some ambiguity there because later on, Theodore does refer to Nicaea II as ecumenical. And I bring this issue up in my book on the papacy. But so there you have it. Rome did not ratify it until the 9th century, like 869, I believe. Yeah. So it took a long time for Rome to actually start numbering it. But those two letters from Hadrian defending the veneration of images, those were going all over the place in the Greek language. Everybody just thought that Rome had ratified it pretty much.
If I could also add, Rome not ratifying Nicaea II and that impeding its ability to be ecumenical, that is attested to by Nicaea II itself, which lays out what is required for an ecumenical council, which is that in their condemnation of Huria, they say the reason they're not ecumenical is because they did not have the cooperation of Rome, as is the rule for councils, right? So according to Nicaea II itself, it was absolutely necessary for an ecumenical council to have the ratification of Rome. So that's once again where I pointed out, like, I don't really know where Seraphim is going with this logic of like, well, Nicaea II was ecumenical without the approval of Rome. Well, by Nicaea II standards, that's not true. So that's just something I wanted to point out.
Yeah, and speaking of the necessity of Rome, I think Elijah, right before he leaves, he can just really knock out of the park, answering the question of when anyone in the first millennium was looking for a pope to definitively settle a doctrinal matter, which was a question that Seraphim had raised. So, Elijah, the floor is yours.
Yeah, the question is who in the first millennium was looking for a pope to definitively settle a doctrinal matter? Well, I don't know. St. Cyril and Nestorius went to Pope Celestine to settle a doctrinal problem on the Mother of God. You have Flavian who wrote to Pope Leo. You have what Erick mentioned with 649, Stephen of Dore. I mean, it's all over the first millennium. I mean, you even have the Pelagians controversy. They wrote to the Pope and to settle the matter. It's all over the place. And then sometimes the popes just involve themselves, like Pope Victor in the 2nd century on the Eastern controversy. And Ben hit it right on the mark when he talked about 649 and how councils are to be looked at, ecumenical councils. You can't just have the Pope and, a few bishops. Even the canons that we have, the canon law on ecumenical councils, it doesn't just say the Pope alone. It says the Pope together with the council fathers makes up an ecumenical council, right? It's not just one person calling the shots. So, but let's answer the question in a different way. Why should we expect them to in the first place? Not that they didn't, they did, but why should we expect them to? Because the question actually assumes that the Pope is inspired by God and has an oracle to God. So if you think the Pope has all the answers, then sure, you would go to the Pope and ask him to settle the matter. But the Pope is not inspired, nor does he have all the answers. As Vatican I says, he is not inspired, but he has a divine assistance. And the divine assistance is a natural means for the Pope to get to the answer that's in question. So how does he do that? Is he goes and works with his brother bishops together with them, and they settle the matter together. It's not like he's this wise man sitting on a mountain that you go to and he has all the answers, and you ask him, hey, is Mary the mother of God? And he writes yes. And he goes and looks at his actual treasure of teachings and to see if it's in there, and then he answers the question. Sometimes he does have the answer because it's an obvious answer, an obvious question that he can answer himself. But most of the time, and I would say, I don't know if there's any time where the Pope didn't go and hold a synod in Rome before he answers a question that he's presented with, right? So Leo, before he writes his tome, he goes and holds a synod in Rome. Same thing with Saint Celestine, when that controversy between Saint Cyril and Nestorius. They hold a synod. They're gathering information. They're trying to find out what is the answer. What does the church teach here before they go in and they teach what the church teaches, right? So it's the way Erick puts it, it's not papal automation, right? It's not like you're just automatically printing out answers as questions that are being given to you, right? So the question assumes a false narrative. It assumes something that we don't even teach, the Pope having all the answers and we can just go to him and he settles the matter. Vatican I didn't teach an autocratic, infallible man where, he separates himself from the church. He defines and everyone bows down and says, this is the teaching, and we all follow it. We know that's not how things work, right? That's just not feasible. That's not practical. And even Gasser at Vatican I says that the present preaching of the magisterium is a rule of faith, even for pontifical definitions. So there is a rule of faith that the Pope follows as far as like, what is the deposit of faith? What do we teach? What have we always taught? That is what he has to work with. What's in scripture and tradition. He can't go outside of that, right? And that's the same thing the church has to work with. So it's both. The Pope goes to the church and says, hey, what do we believe on this matter? And the church answers, that's the consent of the church. And the Pope answers, and that's the consent of the Pope. And that's where we have the headed members working together. So I want to contextualize what a lot of Eastern Orthodox like to emphasize as far as the Pope being this lone ranger, this alone person who can just, pump his chest and be this Rambo Pope. So it doesn't work that way to where we go to this one man and he has all the answers. We go to this one man so that we can settle the matter together. That's how it starts. The process starts that way. The last two Marian dogmas that were declared, the Pope didn't just lock himself in a room. He asked the question to the bishops whether they believe this teaching about the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption in their diocese. And when the popes received the answers from the bishops, they made known the mind of the church. Now, in these matters, with the controversies that we're talking about, the church has not settled the matter because it's a split matter. So there's a split in the church. The East have defected, right? Have gone in the heretical sense. And in 649, you have the West, as you guys were talking about, that held things down. So when folks ask at 1054, how could the Pope act in opposition to the bishops? Well, he's not acting in opposition to the bishops. He's acting in opposition to the Eastern bishops who were just happened to be wrong at the time, the same way they were wrong in 649. So if the Pope needed the Eastern bishops in order for him to have a decree that's authoritative and infallible in 649, then the church would be in shipwreck. There would be calamities there, because then he wouldn't be able to settle the matter if he's missing the East, right? But he's not missing the East in the sense that now he's missing half the church. The church is the bishops in communion with the Bishop of Rome. That's how you know where the church is. So if you're not in communion with the Bishop of Rome, you're no longer part of the church. You don't even count anymore, right? The church is now in 649 the Western Church. That's where the truth is. That's where we have the right teaching, right? It's the Pope and the bishops in the West. So if you have 649 having the West being the only practically the only side that's right, then in 1054, why wouldn't that be possible as well, where the West would be in the right? But again, it's not the Pope alone; it's the Pope and the Western bishops that are in the right? And if you want to be part of the truth, then you want to be part of that side of history, right? 649 and 1054 to me are two examples. The East will just say, well, one is right, 649, the West was right, but the other one, 1054, the East was right. Well, I disagree on that. And to say that the Pope acted alone in any of those is wrong. 1054, the Pope wasn't acting alone. He had the Western bishops, and that's where the truth was. And same thing with 649. I can get into a lot of this, but I'm just going to pass it on to smarter guys here. So, and I'm gonna dip out. So I appreciate you having me here, Suan, and thanks, of course, for being all here.
Yeah, thank you, Elijah. You know, I've always told people that, like, when I try to explain the papacy, I think the best way to kind of conceptualize it is as if, like, quite literally, like, let's say we're a family, and you know, dad leaves home and leaves elder brother Erick in charge, right? And let's say, I don't know, let's say that I'm very articulate and I can charismatically persuade people to go with my decisions. But Erick could always put his foot down at a certain point and say, but I have the claim that dad left me in charge. And that's a distinct claim, because if I break away from that, then I broke away from the head of the family, the father. And so hence I'd be breaking myself from the communion of that family. But on top of that, Erick, if he's going to be a good big brother, he's not always going to use that claim and impose it singularly. He's going to try to work with Ben, myself, and Elijah, who has left the stream, but not the family. So, I mean, I just always thought that image of, like, the Pope as more of an elder brother left in charge by the father is a very helpful image. We use this type of, like, juridical, legal, precise language because, you know, we need to define our terms carefully. But the underlying reality of that is a family structure. Yeah. So I don't want the legal language to obscure, but it helps in clarifying that underlying structure.
Yeah, I was reminded of your point, Suan. I was watching one of my favorite movies recently. It's called The Last Castle. I don't know if anybody's seen it here. It's with old Robert Redford. It's really good. And in that movie, it's about a prison that is basically gone corrupt. The leadership, the head of the prison, the colonel's corrupt, and the inmates are basically being they're enslaved. And a 3-star general ends up committing a crime, some stupid crime he was accused of, and he ends up becoming an inmate, and he helps the inmate basically wage a civil war against the prison leadership. And in that movie, the colonel that leads the prison, he's abusing his authority left and right, doing everything that the law book tells that he can do. But he lost everyone's trust. He lost everyone's appreciation. And so it shows that even the wisest people who are in charge are still understand that there's a wise way to lead, and that is always going to be with a way that makes the atmosphere comporting with human expectation of respect,
right?
Where it's not one person that does everything, but that there's a shared responsibility. And so it's kind of like what Wesley Chambers says. It's like a very nice person with a big stick, in case something goes wrong. But most of the time, whether it's the wisdom of emperors, the wisdom of the Proverbs, Solomon, Marcus Aurelius, all these guys that may have wielded dictatorial power according to the books, they all knew that in the practical outworking of leadership, there's just a way to do it that is more suitable to the goal. And absorbing everything because of a legal right is a short way to being assassinated. Yeah.
Right. And it's a way to sin, right? Because then you
Yeah.
start
Oh, yeah,
disregarding
yeah.
the dignity of the other parties that are involved in the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's overexerted, yeah.
Yeah, if I could add something to that, one thing that just came to my mind was, our Lord's teaching on how to wield authority in his
Right.
church. Do not lord it over them as the Gentiles do. Like, if the papacy is part of the church as Christ established it, you would kind of expect to see that principle at least lived out ordinarily, right? Not saying that there's like this infallible promise that the popes are always going to be using their authority, in the best way possible, but you would at least expect that to be not out of the ordinary, that the popes are not going to be lording their authority over everybody at all times. But at most, there are times obviously where they do have to invoke their own authority. I mean, think about even
Right.
like the Apostle Paul, like how many of, Paul's letters he's saying like, I am the Apostle Paul, you have to listen to me. Like, there are times when the popes have to do that too. Like, I am the successor of Peter, you have to listen. And there's this kind of, like atmosphere, like going back to the days of the apostles, where like everybody hates the boss, and sometimes he has to assert his authority, but that's not the way things ordinarily should run.
Right.
So yeah.
Didn't Paul say, should I bring a rod to the Corinthians? At one point, he's like, should I come with a rod, or should I come in, some sort of gentle way?
Well,
Right,
let's get to the last two points that Erick wanted to talk about.
for sure.
The first is just the ex-cathedra conditioning. So Seraphim basically says papal infallibility did not have a recognizable feature in the first millennium, and so it's useless. Ex-cathedra's or the ex-cathedra conditionality was created in the second millennium. So that's let's tackle that one, and then the last one's going to be kind of a heavy topic, but let's keep going. Yeah. So Ben, do you want to start us off with this? Is the ex-cathedra conditioning useless and an invention?
Yeah, I can start us off. I mean, I would say to echo Seraphim's point that he made at the beginning of his video, like the first question we should ask shouldn't be, is this useful? Is this not useful? Right? It should be, is this actually a reality? So not to like turn that question back on him, but and obviously, he's not saying that because it's useless, therefore it's wrong, obviously.
Yeah.
But just want to make that point that the first question that we should ask is there an idea of papal infallibility in the first millennium? Right. I think that's a more important question than even like, does it have the specific ex cathedra formulation that is, very limited in its scope that Vatican I comes up with? Because if that's the case, that there is this idea of papal infallibility in the first millennium, right? Even if, Catholicism doesn't live up to that, Eastern Orthodoxy certainly doesn't live up to that, right? And so if we're in the discussion about who is in continuity with the first millennium, which is the major theme of Seraphim's video, if there is a concept of papal infallibility in the first millennium and the East does not have that, then we know that there is a discontinuity there. So I would start by, like we've been referencing, the letter of Pope St. Agatho to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, I think very clearly spells out this idea that the Roman Pontiff, because of the promises that Christ made to Peter, that he will have an infallibility of faith. The profession of faith of, that the libellus of Pope St. Hormisdas says much of the same. But what I think is interesting about the libellus of Pope St. Hormisdas is that it required all of the Eastern Episcopate to say that the Roman Church at that time, in the 6th century, was Orthodox, right? So regardless of whatever else it might say, all we have to do then is say, okay, well, what did the Roman Church in the 6th century believe about her own authority, right? is there this idea of a kind of papal infallibility. All you got to do is turn to Pope St. Gelasius, turn to Pope St. Leo, look at their logic. Pope St. Gelasius, I think, is incredibly explicit about saying that because the Roman See is founded on the uncorrupted profession of Peter's faith, that when issues rise to the summit of the Apostolic See, it cannot fall into error, right? That seems to be the logic that Pope St. Gelasius is getting at. I think that's the implied logic of other popes, like even St. Celestine at the Third Ecumenical Council through Philip the Legate, St. Leo the Great, right? This idea that the buck has to stop with Rome in doctrinal controversies. And if that's the case by divine law, then how is it in fact possible that Rome could fall into heresy? So I think you see that idea very much present in the first millennium. And that already, you can show that there's a discontinuity between the East and the West. And so what I would add about the specific ex cathedra formulation is you have this idea of papal infallibility in the first millennium, very clearly, I think, in many cases. And yet you also have cases like the Pope Honorius case, where a pope is clearly condemned for having taught heresy, not just as a private person, but he writes a letter as the Roman pontiff to Eastern bishops, and they're saying this letter has heresy. So you have these two claims, these two ideas in the first millennium. One, that somehow the See of Peter, because of Christ's promise, is infallible, and yet also the pope can, in some capacity, teach heresy. And so I think something like Vatican I, it's kind of wrestling with those two, and it at least tries to come up with a solution. So even if you disagree with Vatican I's solution, which is to limit the scope of papal infallibility, I think it's a better solution than the East, which just completely nixes one of those, just says, okay, these are incompatible, so we're just going to choose one to get rid of, right? We're just going to keep the papal heresy, we're going to get rid of the papal infallibility. The West, I think, as in my study of East-West, seem to be characteristic of the Western and Uniate position to try and synthesize the tensions that existed in church history. Same thing is about the Filioque. I think this can be applied. Whereas in the Eastern tradition, what I noticed is that there was a tendency just to completely cut out the Western portion. Whatever, any tensions, rather than being resolved and showing a kind of harmony between these traditions, they were just, one was chosen over the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that Seraphim, all due respect to him, is, he was very happy to say that the Orthodox today should get together and figure out what the primate is supposed to do after all. and that's not the Orthodox coming up with some weird conditionality way in the 21st century.
Yeah.
But when it came to 19th century Catholic theologians looking at papal authority and, deducing ex cathedra, all of a sudden now that becomes a method that proves the absence of a history. Well, if that's the case, then the fact that the Orthodox need to get together and figure out what the primate actually does and whether he has line item veto rights or not, then it seems like it boomerangs back to what Seraphim was saying. Now, I don't think he intended that inconsistency, to be fair. But Ben brought up good points about all the claims of papal infallibility in the first millennium. But you do have a recognition right away in the second millennium, right at the beginning, actually. One of the points that Seraphim said was, even in the West, papal infallibility is such a novelty that even after the Greek and Latin schism, you still had Latins thinking that a council was supreme. And he was bringing that up to try and say that, see, papal infallibility, that didn't even spin out of control until centuries after the schism. Well, that's false objectively. Talking about objective data, that's not true. We don't have time to go through all of that, but at the Council of Lyons, 1274, was the first reunion attempt. At that council, it made very clear, it required all the Byzantines to agree that all doctrinal questions are to be resolved by a judgment of the Roman pontiff. And Thomas Aquinas drew from that decree, and basically said this decree makes it certain that the Pope is infallible when he judges on a matter. Okay, so right off the bat, so it's not like we had to wait till the 1800s to get this concept. I mean, even Yves Congar said, I mean, sometimes the later, you know, the Jesuits in the 20th century, or even some of the Dominicans like Yves Congar, a guy like that, to get an admission that infallibility, papal infallibility, was all the way back in the 1200s, that's pretty impressive. But in the same century, there is a canon lawyer. His name is Guido Tereni. He was born in 1270, so, you know, kind of getting out of the 1200s into the 1300s. And in his own study on the papacy, and he's not bringing up new concepts, but Brian Tierney, who's one of the go-tos on the origins of papal infallibility, he says that in Tereni already in the 1200s, we have this specified condition of ex cathedra, something that the Pope teaches to the universal church, whereas if he teaches something less than that, he can be faulty. So there was already, you know, it's not in the 1800s. We're trying to figure out how to get the knight to kill, you know, trying to, like, you know, manipulate the history. We see this already pretty quick in the second millennium. Is there a precise exposition of ex cathedra in the first millennium? No, but what you do see is you've got the epistolaries of the popes, and then around the 4th and 5th century, you start seeing these decretals, the papal decretals, and the constitutions of the Apostolic See. And these were put into like a registry and sent abroad, you know. And so right there, it kind of shows you that there's a mode of decree that they're putting on a shelf that's different than some of the other letters and whatever sermons of Leo that we have preserved.
Yeah, and I'll just add here before we move on that, like, even if the exact formulation and specification of, you know, the conditions for an ex cathedra statement came later, I think you gentlemen were basically saying, like, the idea was there, like,
right,
that the idea that you have to focus on the subject, the act, and the object of the decree or teaching in question. I mean, that seems intuitive to me. That's like with like Newton's law of gravity. You know, people knew that there was a law of gravity, but they had different explanations and theories, some more precise, some less precise. And then I know Newton's law of universal gravitation has problems, but just pretend like it's a solid law for a moment, right? It was the first, like, very precise mathematical formulation of a reality that people were aware of for thousands of years before him. Right. And so it was just a mathematically precise way of stating a truth of what came before. So I think, like, I would just use that analogy in this case. It's not that Newton invented gravity, unlike, you know, certain memes that we see online anyway.
That's a good analogy. Yeah, I the way I thought of it was like a cell. I'm not a biologist or a scientist, so I'm just thinking, you know, the way that we used to know the nature of a cell 30, 40, 50 years ago, you know, we knew like the basics, right? But with higher powered technology, microscopes, whatever, now we know a little bit more about the mitochondria. Maybe we now know a little bit more about certain engines in the cell that we didn't know before. But we all know we're studying a cell, right? Yeah.
I would also maybe add that the extent of papal infallibility, in a certain sense, is still being debated today in the Catholic Church.
Yeah,
that's right.
Like, there are different perspectives on, you know, different levels of papal teaching, even to this day. And yet we wouldn't say that, you know, somebody like Dr. John Joy versus maybe somebody who has like a higher, you know, like a view of like more ultramontane view of like everything the Pope says is infallible. We wouldn't say that they like reject the Catholic doctrine of the papacy, or that they're like now quasi, you know, proto Eastern Orthodox, or, you know, having like some kind of non-Catholic ecclesiology. Like, you can have disagreements about, you know, the exact way these doctrines get worked out, but that doesn't mean you disagree about the core, which is what, to the point that I made earlier about conciliarists and ultramontanists being able to coexist in the church for centuries without one of them thinking like, oh no, I need to become Orthodox or something.
Yeah, and this is not to drag out our time, but it kind of just reminded me when you brought up like the questions on papal infallibility. Like, I'm not trying to scandalize anybody, but just, going back to the thing I mentioned at the very start of our stream with Ordinatio Sacerdotalis and John Paul II, you had Cardinal Ratzinger initially saying that this was just an exercise of the ordinary magisterium of the Pope and not meant to be an infallible decree, just a confirmation of what was there in the universal ordinary magisterium. But then if you go to John Joy's book, when Cardinal Ratzinger becomes Pope Benedict XVI, he then does start saying that John Paul II spoke infallibly, irrevocably, settling the matter at hand. And so, how you cash that out, that's a fair question. But I think Joy makes really strong arguments that it's possible that Cardinal Ratzinger, was mistaken the first time around. And he was mistaken because he thought papal infallibility only pertained to the definitions of not new teachings in the sense of innovations and stuff like that, but in the sense of
very controversial points.
Sure. But then and I think Elijah and others have talked about this, the Pope can definitively confirm something that's already taught in the universal ordinary magisterium, and that would still count under his infallibility. So it's not that he's he doesn't necessarily have to always propose from the chair. He can confirm from the chair what the brother bishops have already been saying for centuries.
Yeah.
Just to get that there. Anyway, to the last question, which is the death penalty. So basically, Seraphim's claim is that the idea of Catholicism creating clarity is ruined by the recent decree on the death penalty. I know we could probably go for 3 hours on this one. I'm willing to do that, but I don't know about you gentlemen. So maybe, Erick, I'll let you set the tone.
Well, we don't need to go into all the details about the death penalty per se, but I think one of the things we should clarify right off, right at the beginning of this is that while there may be a loss of clarity, there is no loss of clarity in that the goal of precision still goes back to the magisterium. So in other words, it's not as if, this is a major collision that causes a ripple in our entire paradigm of doctrinal authority. It just means that on this issue, we've got what looks to be like a tension, right? And that has existed in the first millennium too, on a number of issues. Pelagianism, when Pelagianism was condemned, original sin was put in place. To this day, you have theologians within the Orthodox Church and within the Catholic Church that sometimes they've got some big problems with the doctrine of original sin. They think that what we've dogmatized clashes with other things that are supposed to be true, and we haven't really addressed those matters yet. So there are existing today things that are in tension, and if you don't know about it, perhaps you just haven't read enough about these things. Free will, predestination, there are all kinds of philosophical conundrums, theistic omniscience and free will. It comes up. There's all kinds of quirky questions that if you want to land your plane on a rocky road of theological conundrums, there's more than just the death penalty, right? But I know it's one of those things where it's like, okay, this is on the surface. This just happened. What are you going to do? It looks like Rome has reversed its position. And to be fair, I want to tell Seraphim that I'll hand that to him, that this does look that way. And I'm not going to try to clean his eyes and pretend my eyes see something better. There is something difficult here with what Pope Francis has done. However, just to spill into the details a little bit, the Pope did not explicitly condemn the death penalty as intrinsically evil. I know I've said in the past, and I've written in the past, that that's what the logic seems to fall to. But he may have been a little sloppy in the way that he outputted this decree. What is clear from the decree is that he doesn't think that the death penalty is useful at all today, and therefore it is immoral based upon that, at the very least. And that kind of observation can be found in implied statements from Rome in earlier centuries, because it employed the safety defense, the self-defense, or the defense of the common good argument for the death penalty. In other words, it was not as if it was sinful to not kill someone for committing a capital crime. In fact, there were times where clemency was given and it was seen as a virtue, right? And so if it's not a mandate, because Genesis 9 can be interpreted as almost like a divine mandate, where, if Moses killed somebody, then Moses' blood's got to be given back to God. Or, David committed a crime that was, he was, what do you call it, facilitating the murder of Uriah by getting him up to the front lines. David was not given the death penalty. So is it a divine mandate? Then you've got the principle of the gospel, human dignity. So can we move the needle to the preference of mercy, especially in a context where the elimination of the body is not going to make a difference to the safety of society? So there's these other things that come up, and so it is unclear, but we don't have a settled, this is proof that Rome has erred in the faith. What it does prove is that clarity can be sort of fizzled out for a little bit. But what's not unclear is that we all still know where to go to get the clarity. And that is the doctrinal magisterium of the church. That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful summary. I'm full agreement with you, Eric. I think Seraphim, in the context of his video, correct me if I'm mistaken, I think he brings this up in the context of what the Orthodox Church teaches about contraception. And he's using this to say, the Orthodox Church, doesn't have a definitive ruling on contraception, but the Catholic Church doesn't either, because there used to be this thought to be definitive ruling on the death penalty, but then that was overturned. And Paul VI, nobody thinks that Humanae Vitae really was this ex cathedra decree, and so the Catholic teaching on contraception is just as susceptible to being overturned as the death penalty. I think that was the logic that Seraphim was going, just to show that equality, Orthodox and Catholics are kind of in the same position. But I would say the difference between the Orthodox and Catholic position on the issue of contraception, not to mention, I believe it was Pius X, one of the Piuses, Castini Canubi. Some people have defended that as being ex cathedra condemnation of contraception. But the difference would be, obviously, we believe that it is still in principle possible for that doctrinal matter to be definitively settled. And so, when it comes to non-definitive teachings of the popes, I tend to agree with the thesis of John Joy that I think papal infallibility allows for there to be false teachings, even, you could say heretical teachings, at least materially heretical teachings from the Pope. when he's not speaking in that definitive capacity. Yet that doesn't therefore eliminate the usefulness of having a definitive teaching. Just because the Pope can teach error doesn't mean that now if the Pope were to come out tomorrow and say, I ex cathedra declare the death penalty is morally just, that means nothing, that's not useful.
Right.
But in terms of the actual content of the death penalty teaching itself, I don't think it poses a problem to the doctrine of papal infallibility. Pope Francis is not saying, because the way that John Joy explicates papal infallibility, which I think is just brilliant because it coheres so much with the work that Erick, that you've done, the work that I've done in my study of the papacy, it all kind of seems to cohere together, is that what it means for a teaching to be definitive, to be infallible, is just that the Pope is presenting you with a choice. You either have communion with him and the Church of God, or you don't, right? That you have to accept that it's a condition for communion, right? That's essentially what an ex cathedra teaching is, that you have to accept this if you want to share the communion of the Catholic Church, right? Now, Pope Francis, I don't think he ever excommunicated anybody besides maybe was Archbishop Vigano and a couple of people who said mean things about him. He certainly didn't excommunicate anybody for criticizing his teaching on the death penalty. He did not excommunicate anybody for even calling him a heretic. Aside from a few cases like Archbishop Vigano, like there were lists of clergy who all accused Pope Francis of teaching multiple heresies, and the vast majority of those people were never excommunicated, never condemned. And so just by applying the logic of Vatican I, like that would mean that Pope Francis did not regard his teaching on the death penalty to be a definitive decree. And obviously canon law says that we only know an infallible decree if it's the manifest will and intent of the Pope. And if you have someone coming to the Pope saying, hey, I think that's a heretical teaching, and he's like, okay, like that's a sign that maybe he didn't intend that to be a definitive decree. I think Daniel J. Castellano, who writes at Arcane Knowledge, has a very interesting article actually on the death penalty. I don't know that I fully agree with it, but he talks about how there actually was early patristic witnesses who were opponents of the death penalty. There was controversy about like military service and Christians. So there are actually some patristic roots to this idea that there's some conflict between gospel teachings and the death penalty. Like, I don't think Pope Francis just pulled that out of thin air.
Right.
But I just want to mention that there are other perspectives worth considering. I don't necessarily agree with those. I tend to agree more with, Ed Fazer and his book on capital punishment, I think is representative of the truth of the matter. But those are things just worth mentioning.
Yeah, and to just drop my 2 cents and then we'll move into audience Q&A. I don't think that the death penalty is intrinsically evil, just based on like arguments from Fazer and others, like just biblical witness, patristic witness, natural law. But there is this question that I think about, which is basically like, okay, it's not intrinsically evil, but that isn't necessarily a positive reason to do it. And in fact, you could have all kinds of reasons not to do it that are morally significant. So for example, take divine justice as just one case. And I think this is where the idea of like the logic of the gospel militating against the death penalty comes in, where you have God who in his divine right could have not become incarnate and just let us all go to hell. Like he was not obligated to save us. He was within his divine rights to have done that. But out of the generosity and goodness of his own heart, that he is love, that he is goodness itself, he willed to become incarnate and to save us, right? There's something interesting in the Christian life where even though mercy by its nature to some extent, right, it's not obligatory, it's not owed to the person in the ordinary means of justice and how we cash out justice, meaning what's due to another, but it becomes obligatory in light of the gospel. If you think about it, right? Like I need to show mercy to this person because Christ first showed mercy to me. This person was made in the image of God. You can then start speaking in a way that seems like you just say, look, even if I'm technically within my rights to take down this person for the horrible things that they did, the act is so ugly, the act is so crude that I just can't. And I think that's a way in which you can tie that delicate bow without necessarily contradicting, I think, what's there in the apostolic deposit.
Yeah,
that's the way to do it. That's the way to do it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one way I thought is that I was just going to say Pope Francis's teaching on the death penalty seems like a particular application of just war theory in a sense. So
Mhm.
I'm okay with theologians exploring that idea. I think, yeah. Anyways, I'll leave it at that.
All right, very good. All right, gentlemen. Let me just start off with the super chats. So, servant of the Lord, Kyrios, God bless you guys. Thank you for the super chat, 50 euros. Every time I see the euro sign, I think it's cents, and then I'm like, huh, 50 cents. Oh no, it's sorry. And then August Par, if I said that right, small amount for Swan, amount to $5. Going to give some for D Wong later. It's Indonesian rupiah, if I said that right. Thank you so much for your super chat. Okay, let me start off with a. Okay, there's this one chat I want to really get to, but I'll save that for the very end.
Okay.
Seraph asked, "Is being Eastern Orthodox or Catholic a salvation issue?"
Hmm.
Ben or Eric, who wants to go first?
Eric can take that one if he wants.
Well, yes,
Yeah.
it is. And it's interesting because Sarah from Hamilton brought up the point that, it's not like the Greek patriarchs in the 12th, 13th, 14th century were talking to Pope Benedict XVI. And, and Seraphim brought up the issue of Pope Boniface VIII, Eugene IV, that said, in one decree to the Armenians, or I can't remember which one it is, but even if you shed your blood for Christ, if you are not united to the Roman Pontiff, you cannot be saved. That's actually still what the Catholic Church teaches in Vatican II. In fact, if you find yourself having a couple of hours of free time, read Lumen Gentium. It's one of the constitutional documents of Vatican II. Paragraphs 14 to 16. And what you'll see there is that when Jesus says, "Go into the world and preach the gospel to every creature, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved," Vatican II takes that as an implication of the one Catholic Church being divinely necessary for salvation. And because that church is governed by the successor of Peter, it is logically necessary that one be submissive to the Roman Pontiff for salvation, just as much as it is obligatory for you to be a baptized member of the Church of Christ. However, it proceeds to say more, and this is where untrained minds, perhaps lack of clarity, all these other things come into play. Almost seems to like completely erase that point, but it doesn't erase that point. Vatican II, like what had been done already for 100 years before, is taking more concentration on the level of culpability, the possibility of being saved while being invincibly ignorant of the gospel call, principles that are all ancient. None of those principles are new. Vatican II takes ancient principles and says it is possible for someone outside the true church to be saved on certain conditions. They are invincibly ignorant. They, under the assistance of divine grace, seek to do and follow their conscience, and obey God's precepts as best as they know, and they die in charity. So that goes for Orthodox, Protestants, and even non-Christians, and that goes back to the 19th century even. So it is a salvation issue because the Lord's law is the Lord's law. Okay. But we do know of exceptions according to ancient biblical principles.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what I would say as well, is that, yeah, I mean, that's belonging to the church that Christ founded.
Right.
Is, the means of salvation is what the church is, right? The sacrament of salvation, I believe, is what Lumen Gentium refers to the church as, referring to the one Catholic Church and not to any offshoots therefrom. So,
right.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see if we can get to this one a bit quickly. Tony L, the Good Fight with Tony L asked, have Eastern Orthodox figures or scholars ever tried to appeal to Galatians 2, aka the Antioch incident, to rationalize their position or deny/lower the primacy of the Roman See?
Nothing comes to my mind. I imagine Erick would probably know better.
Nothing comes to my mind either. I
Interesting.
mean, I'm sure there are at least Orthodox online. As far as like a figure or scholar, maybe Laurent Kleinenwerk. That's the closest thing I can come to from his Broken Body, the book that he wrote. He may bring that point up, but other than that, I'm not settled and clear on that.
Yeah, I've only heard this objection from Protestant circles. Another big one. JTG21 asked, before Vatican I, could a Catholic be a conciliarist and not be a heretic?
I would say, I mean, as far as I'm aware, conciliarism was condemned by Pope Eugene IV and the Council of Florence. So no. Of course, depending on how conciliarist is being defined here, because I think that can take on a variety of meanings depending on that. I don't know if Erick, you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I think it's, it kind of goes back to the gravity point that Suan made, the cell point that I made, and that is that 2 words were already put into the magisterial registry of Rome. It's full power. I think it's plenitudo potestas. Yeah. Full power was given to Peter and his successor to lead, govern, teach, and pastor the universal church. Now, full power logically excludes the conciliarism, the way all the various models and proposals, but not everybody knew that those 2 words excluded conciliarism. So there were people all the way up to Vatican I that were teaching at university positions. They were receiving communion, but they did teach that the Roman pontiff, he has full power, but he can't use it until the episcopate joins him. Of course, that's a logical, because that would make his full power subtracted. So it just took the logical push, and that's why we get Vatican I. So there were some people who were still trying to hold out to a Gallican theory of infallible output, and Vatican I kind of like sealed the deal on that one.
All right, here's the last chat we're going to look at. So earlier, Erick, you were talking, and I don't know if you saw me on the screen, but I was giggling, and I think Elijah Yossi was as well. And it was not because you said something funny. Everything you said in the stream is just fire, like straight fire. But Jay Guevara said, Erick's so on fire right now that his smoke alarm is acting up.
Yeah, I realized that. I gotta grab. I realized that, and this is not the first time this has happened to me. I don't know what it is. I probably have to replace it, but I've got to have a stash of 9-volt batteries ready at the hand with this. So yeah.
Yeah, Erick. Oh my gosh, when I saw that, I just couldn't stop laughing. It's no, but Erick, yeah, everything you said tonight was fire, and I just encourage everybody. I know it's a long video. Ben, same to you, and Elijah, same to you. Like, just great content tonight, and I would just really encourage people to thoughtfully consider and watch this video, because we go into the nitty-gritty nuance. We get into the material at hand, and we go. I think we provide a really strong case, an explanation and clarification of what the Catholic Church teaches. So, guys, this was great. Ben, Erick, do you want to say anything before we leave?
No, yeah, just thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate that we were able to take the time to. I actually didn't know how long we were going to go on for, but I'm glad that we were able to take this time to go into detail. And Erick, brilliant as always. Elijah as well, brilliant, and Suan as well. So just love to talk these things out with people who know their stuff. So I appreciate being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. You guys did great. I agree with you, Suan. This was definitely well worth the time spent going through all this because Seraphim is a very smart guy, and he was able to download so much stuff on that are deep thought. These are deep thoughts that he had, and so it requires equal depth to get in to look at it and examine it. And yeah, it was lengthy, but anybody who's really serious and curious and they need something at the same depth to which it deserves, this is what we provided. So I think we did a good job. Yeah.
All right. With that, gentlemen, I think I'm going to end the stream. Everyone have a great night or a good morning wherever you are.
God bless.